Hello and welcome to another edition of the Establish the Edge podcast. I'm your host, Mark Dankenbring, and joined today once again by the projections crew you know and love, Jack Miller and Ben Gretch. Jack and I are part of the NFL projections team here at Establish a Run, entering our fourth year together, doing this full time. And then Gretch is our honored guest. You can listen to his podcast, Stealing Bananas with Sean Siegel, as well as find his work at bengretch.substack.com. We are on to episode 4 today of this series. We'll be going through all 4 teams in the NFC West. It's a little peek behind the curtain. We are recording this on the same day as episode 3, the AFC West, with which we just hit. So, staring down 5 hours of content in the face today. Gretch, how you feeling about that? Is that a new personal record for you, or
No.
what's going on? Yeah,
I wish it was a new personal record, but with all the different, draft streams and things, I've done some 5-hour streams before. But yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to go this deep on all these teams. We should note at the top here that part of the reason we're doing 2 in a row today is we have a little bit of a break coming up. You're doing a little traveling, so there might be a little bit of a break in our release dates with the pods, but we'll be back like early to mid July, like a little later. Just enjoy your 4th of July weekend before that 5th one hits your guys' feed.
well, that's why we're making these all 2+ hours in length, so the people have all the content they can handle. As I'm heading out on family vacation in early July over the 4th. So we'll be back, July 11th, and we'll continue recordings from there. But yeah, Jack, how you doing here, entering this second pod of the day?
I'm doing good. Yeah, I think the break that we've kind of organically fallen into is probably a good thing, like you guys said, with our inability to keep these podcasts under 2.5 hours. So people need some time to actually listen to them instead of dumping, 20 hours at one time. But I'm excited to be here for the NFC West.
Absolutely. Super fun division to talk through here. Obviously, the reigning Super Bowl champions, Seattle Seahawks, the LA Rams in this division, as well as San Francisco 49ers. And then, of course, Arizona Cardinals kind of bottom of the barrel here. But 3 of the best teams in the NFL in this NFC West division. So it should be a fun one to talk through here. We are going to start
and
in
we
LA.
Have just on the division point, we have all McVay Shanahan tree stuff, right? Like that's branched out throughout the league, but you obviously had it with Kubiak in Seattle. He leaves and they hire from San Francisco and they're trying to replicate that in Seattle. You obviously have Shanahan and McVay here, and then LaFleur taking over in Arizona. So the whole idea of like this tree is at the forefront of offensive innovation in this sport. All 4 of the teams here are part of, and obviously the top of the tree, both McVay and Shanahan. So a lot to discuss there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I honestly hadn't fully put that together, that like Seattle, their offensive coordinator came from San Francisco this year. And then obviously Mike LaFleur, a new head coach of the Cardinals, comes from the Rams. So that is a pretty interesting intersection there. We will talk through the Rams here first. Play caller will be Sean McVay once again this year. And the Rams are an interesting team because they kind of led the 13 personnel charge that we saw last year. So that kind of headlines the team notes for the Rams this offseason. They also brought in Cliff Kingsbury to be, on the offensive staff here for the Rams. I got some pace notes here from Pat Thorman. He noted that with Cliff Kingsbury as an offensive coach, all 6 of his teams have ranked first in no huddle rates, when Cliff has been on staff. And so that's something when we're trying to predict kind of like some of the new trends in the NFL. I do think this Rams team could kind of return to more of an up-tempo style. McVay in his first handful of seasons was more up-tempo as well. Thorman has a note on that here, just kind of commenting that when he first got his first 5 offenses ranked top 4 in no huddle rate did McVay. So bringing in Cliff Kingsbury here to potentially kind of have like a new meta trend or kind of lean back into that tempo for the Rams is something we'll certainly keep an eye on this year. On a team level projections input, we have 62.7 plays for the Rams. Gretch is at 63.2. We're at a 59.8% pass rate. Gretch at 59%. So pretty aligned there. Jack, I'm curious your thoughts on this Rams offense, who had a picture of health last season, like in August in training camp. We saw the immortal chamber for Matthew Stafford at training camp. People were saying, oh, this could be just an absolutely brutal season. He ends up playing all 17 games and looking great, turning on an MVP season. So what's your outlook on this 2026 Rams offense?
Yeah, I think as long as Stafford stays healthy, they're probably looking to run it back. They jumped from 20th in pass rate over expectation in 2024 all the way up to third last year, and that obviously worked out great. One note on the Rams is that they are implied for the most points per game in the league. We have actually docked them a little bit down to the point where they're tied for fourth. And as we get into the players here in a minute, we are still pretty much above market on every Rams player, despite being lower than where Vegas has them from a scoring expectation. But Gretch and us are pretty in line here, and honestly, we are kind of throughout this whole division, but pretty close on both play volume and pass rate, which is good to see.
Yeah, not only one of the best offenses, but one of the most condensed. And so that's kind of what has led us to be ahead of market this year, I think, too, is just that condensing, expecting those targets and opportunities in the offense to remain condensed.
Well, that'll be really interesting, because when I write one of my end of season articles, I do the series called Field Tippers, where I look at the per route run stuff, and I look at every team and go team by team, and I use 100 routes as a minimum to grab anyone who played a decent amount. Just a couple of years ago, the Rams had 6 players who ran 100 routes. This past year, they had 12, which is like the very low end of the spectrum, the very high end of the spectrum, right? I mean, you have 5 eligibles on a given play. They had 10 guys who had 23 plus targets this year. It's still concentrated at the top with Puka and Devontae Adams for sure, but they did a lot more with the sub packages and all that stuff. When asked back in March about the 13 personnel again, and we've talked about this, we talked about it with the Liam Cohen quote when we did it with the Jags. McVay gave the quote that I think just speaks to the whole league and everything we've talked about. But he said, yeah, I think if you have the guys that can bring it to life, we had depth at the tight end spot last year, so it was favorable for us. I think the thing we've learned over 9 years is that we can't kid ourselves into thinking that the same things are going to be successful again. We've got to continue to adapt, adjust, and evolve. It's that point we made in the very first show. The defenses are trying to figure out new solutions. Good coaches like McVay are not just going, oh, hey, 13 personnel worked last year, I'm going to build my whole offense out of 13 personnel, and not expect them to be doing things. So you self-scout and you evolve on your own as well. You guys just talked about tempo with the addition of Kingsbury as a potential next evolution. I think that's a really interesting point. It is interesting to think about where this team's going to go at a really hard time figuring out the concentration element, for example, especially behind Puka. They have one of the better offensive lines by all accounts. And I agree with Jack that, I mean, as long as Stafford stays healthy, I am a little bit concerned about, I mean, going into last year, Stafford's back and all that stuff. And then now he's an MVP and we're all just kind of, I think, assuming that he's going to be good, but they do feel a little bit fragile in that respect. They have a really old quarterback. And I think and then also I think behind Puka, they're relatively fragile, because we'll talk about Adams, but Adams, profile looked a little concerning last year. So you kind of need those two guys out there, but as long as you have them out there, much higher pass rate last year. I expect them to have a high pass TD rate. They were throwing a lot in close. The pass TD rate, when you go like position by position, we talked about how that stuff feeds back to the quarterback. The running backs had huge receiving TD rates. And Stafford often throws to them. The tight ends had huge rates last year. All of them. They use a bunch of them. They all had big touchdown rates. And then obviously you have Devontae Adams and then Puka. So like I got done with my projection for a team that has a high touchdown expectation. I was actually above it. And I was like, I got to bring this pass TD rate down. It's too high. Stafford can't throw this many touchdowns, but he threw a ton last year.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that a little bit too, because, Stafford threw 46 touchdowns last year, had a 7.7% TD rate, just, pretty astronomical numbers there, as you alluded to. And so expecting and projecting regression, I think is pretty practical here, especially as he enters his age 38 season here. And for Stafford, we have cut him down to a 5.5% TD rate. Jack kind of mentioned, like, we started the offseason, we typically align our projections to the implied team totals for these guys as well. And doing that for the Rams just got us like way above market on the entire team. And we are still above market, but that's even after dialing things back a little bit. So Gretch, I was curious where you would come in. You actually had a 6% TD rate on Stafford, project him to throw 36 touchdowns. We're at 5.5%, as I mentioned, and more like 32 touchdowns. So certainly, expecting it to dial it back a bit, but it is kind of tough to find out where like the through line, the middle line is going to be here for Stafford, because he's kind of oscillated season by season. When the Rams won the Super Bowl, it was really high touchdown rate, kind of dipped the last couple of years, and then certainly last year a massive spike there. And it's also tough to know too. Like, I think the narrative throughout the season was, oh, they want Stafford to win this MVP when they're at the goal line. They're going to continue to throw fades to Devontae Adams and like lean into that. So just curious, Gretch, your thoughts on kind of handling that statistical regression for Stafford specifically.
Yeah, really tricky. 7.7% was the number last year, career high by nearly a full percentage point. We were at 6 and 5.5, you mentioned. So we're regressing between, 2 to 2.5 ish percentage points. But what's fascinating, so he's QB 14 right now. When you get into pocket passers in that range, you're kind of looking for a guy who's going to spike a pass TD rate because they're not going to add a lot of rushing. And that's how a guy like Stafford winds up the late round QB. That's interesting. Usually coming off a spiked pass TD rate like this, you have to pay like QB8 prices the next year. Like Baker Mayfield last year was like QB8 coming off the year prior. We have him at QB 14. This is still a team projected for the most touchdowns by look ahead lines, the most points. As you noted, you guys kind of brought them down. I end up pairing my touchdowns straight to that number, and then I just kind of make a mental note. I wonder if their look ahead lines are so favorable because their team is so strong, their defense is so much better with Myles Garrett. And I kind of like that you guys brought that down. I was like, I don't think they have the single very best offense or anything like that, but like way above everyone else, but their look ahead lines kind of make you feel that way. But as far as like a QB 14 that might spike enough touchdowns to be the dude outside the QB ones who goes on to, be a top 5 quarterback or something just off pass TD rate, why wouldn't we bet on the guy? Like, this is one of these things in 2026 where like regression's been such a thing in the fantasy football market for 20 years that people over regress. We're just like, we talked on the last show that the QBs in this range are very tightly compact. And I understand that some of the other profiles probably have more ceiling and there's a little bit of element there, but this is a team that's expected to score a lot of touchdowns, and they just threw a ton of touchdowns, and they have a lot of the personnel back. They don't have a great, like, hardcore running game in tight, probably. It's a bit surprising to me that he's, not as cheap as he's not that cheap, but
yeah. No, I mean,
it's not a bad price.
Yeah, again, coming off quarterback 2 and points per game last year, and getting drafted right now at quarterback 14. Certainly think probably some opportunity there. Let's get into the backfield, though. This is a, I think, hotly contested backfield every single season. It's been since Kyren Williams. I'm old enough to remember, and when Kyren Williams was just going to be the punt returner for the Rams, and his backfield duties were going to get taken away, and he rattled off a top 5 running back season there. So coming into this year, you kind of have those rumors again. Oh, Blake Corum is looking more like a 50-50 split with Kyren in the backfield. I've always been in the camp like, man, Sean McVay and the Rams just absolutely love Kyren Williams. He's I think going to have to get injured to cede his job or any more meaningful work to a backup, just given what he provides this team. But in terms of inputs, we are at 212 carries on Kyren and 45 targets. Gretch is at 230 carries and 48 targets, so slightly above there on Kyren. And then on Corum, we are at 154 carries, about 20 targets. Gretch is at 137 carries and 16 targets. So again, hotly debated split here. Jack, take us into our projections here at ETR and how we're viewing this split heading into this upcoming season.
Yeah, so the Rams definitely do still love Kyren, but it did settle into more of a committee last year. After week 5, Corum had at least a 33% designed run share in every game except one. The Athletics' Nate Atkins recently wrote that he thinks it's going to be more of a 50-50 split this year. Corum was more productive in the same offense on a per carry basis. He was at 5.1 yards per carry versus Kyren's 4.8. On rush yards over expected per attempt, it was Corum at 0.85 and Kyren at 0.57. I think Kyren has the pass down stuff on lock. Kyren also outcarried Corum from inside the 5. He outcarried Corum 18-9 from inside the 5 last year. And I don't know if it's quite going to be a 50-50 split, but I really do think that Corum made some serious progress at Kyren's rushing role last year. And given how effective it was, the combo, I kind of think that that's going to continue in kind of a 60-40 split if both are healthy. And then the upside case for both is truly massive if the other one gets hurt. I think both have really elite contingent upside because Jarquez Hunter has shown nothing to this point. And so I think that we're actually above market on both backs, a little bit more so on Corum, projecting maybe a closer rushing split than the market has. But I think both are pretty interesting just given the contingent upside if the other one goes down.
And you mentioned that 60-40 number. That's I just want to say that's essentially where we have it right now. We have 58% for Kyren, 42% for Corum. If you're just looking at those two specifically and ignoring any touches we have for Jarquez Hunter.
Yeah, I like that. That's that note about how Corum cut into Kyren more. I kind of just mapped it to the end of season stuff, but it makes sense that if you're looking at sort of where they were, like even just from like week 5 on for most of the season, that I'm a little too wide on the Kyren rushing stuff. On the receiving stuff, they had 65 running back targets last year. It was, I think, their 5th or 6th straight season with like under 76 targets. I'm trying to find the number in my notes, but I don't have it right in front of me. Anyway, they for the entire running back position, 7 straight seasons, 76 total running back targets or fewer. They had 65 last year. Kyren did get 50 of them. He basically gets all of the receiving work, so you can get a little bit, and you noted that. And Kyren's over 250 PPR points now in 3 straight years. But I do think there's some clear like dead zone running back tendencies to him too. He's not necessarily going in the like the dead zone. The running backs are being pushed up a little bit. He's like a late third. But the fact that a guy would be 3 straight 250 PPR point seasons and be in the best offense in football, and drafters are still not willing to take him in the top 2 rounds is like a classic sort of dead zone-y type thing where the market is kind of telling you something about what they think about this player. And I think that's sort of what you're saying as well with the split on Blake Corum taking a lot of that work. Corum posted as far as the receiving stuff, a putrid 2.6 yards per target and 0.31 yards per route run. So again, I still think Kyren's big routes lead feels pretty safe, but the fact that he could like seed a lot of rushing is not, I mean, I have a tough time with Kyren. I do like, he's a compiler. He's been really productive compiling a lot of great stats and a great offense over several years. So I'm kind of different. I'm out on both to a certain degree. Like I have a hard time with the Corum profile as well with no receiving. I think it's okay in like an underdog, but there's a tricky element of like you're not getting all the rushing work and you're not necessarily getting goal line work and you're not getting really any receiving work. And so that part of it. Now to Jack's point, if Kyren were to miss time or vice versa, the Hunter thing I'm maybe not discounting as much as you guys just because of how little Corum did in year 1 and then just was out of the blue in a much bigger role in year 2. They did that with Kyren once upon a time as well, though he got hurt for most of his rookie year. But they talked about Hunter in a very favorable way last year. I'm a little bit when we get to tight end, Terrence Ferguson's another one that they really like, and they really didn't use him a lot last year, but he's another one that I'm like, are they just going to like unleash him in year 2? McVay and the Rams do things a little bit differently in the way that they're famously the one team that doesn't go to the combine and the way that they identify young players and who they draft and all these things. Obviously like Puka was in a huge role right away. So this is not a universal point that has fit to everything that they've done with rookies or anything. But if one of them went down, I do wonder if Hunter would play a little bit more as well. It's a tricky backfield because it is a very valuable backfield. And I do take that point. But on Hunter, he had really good collegiate rushing profile, great evasion, breakaway, yards after contact, like far better than like Corum's, for example. So I don't know. It's just a tricky.
It's interesting to hear you say that you're not super in on either Kyren or Corum, just because our inputs are more conservative on Kyren. We're still above market on him, and then we are a little bit hotter on Corum inputs than you, and are above market on him as well. But I just think if the touches remain consolidated on those two and what we expect to be a top 5 offense in the league, I think probably in best ball I feel solid drafting them might be more of a headache in redrafts, especially if Corum.
I think that's a big part of it too. I tend to think about things more from a redraft lens, but I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and I don't know. I feel like I've been a consistent person to stand up for Kyren last couple of years. I just feel like the fantasy community is eager to see him get passed by for whatever reason, and the Rams continue to go to him, and I feel like we have it projected in a conservative enough place that the fact that we're still above market, like he has been a draft target to me, despite the potential kind of dead zone concerns there.
I think I would be more in on him than Corum, to be clear, at cost, because to me the Corum profile is just really tricky, that it's all based on rushing efficiency. You mentioned he had over 5 yards per carry last year. Like I don't want to just bet on yards per carry rush efficiency, unless I think there's like role
looking at
growth.
I was looking at kind of like the yards after contact stuff as well between the two, and Pro Football Reference has Kyren as better in yards after contact per attempt, as well as PFF in terms of Kyren over Corum, which I thought was interesting, just given that I feel like people have labeled Corum as the more efficient and like explosive back, whereas Kyren has consistently kind of churned out very solid yards after contact metrics, despite not necessarily being the most explosive guy.
I do think the pass catching stuff is fair. I still think Corum, if Kyren were to go down, would have a pretty valuable role, because he would presumably be getting all of the goal line stuff. I mentioned that Kyren outcarried him 18-9 inside the 5 last year. So Kyren was ahead there, but that's basically just in line with where the overall carries were. So it's not like Kyren was the goal line back. It's just that he had more carries in general. And that kind of lended itself to having more carries inside the 5. And then in college, Corum was a touchdown machine. So I think it's fair to say that he'd be the clear goal line back if Kyren went down on a top 3 or 4 offense in the league conservatively. Which I think would be a pretty valuable role.
One more counter note to my pessimism. Both of these guys got some air yards last year. I've talked about the running back air yard stuff. A lot of times it's negative for a running back. Their ADOT is literally negative, or it's between -1. Their ADOT's maybe 0.1 or 0.2. Kyren had 170 air yards last year. That's a lot for a running back. And Corum himself had 30, despite basically no real pass down role. I don't have his ADOT in front of me, but it was like, I mean, we talked about this on the last show, but the next evolution of some of these offenses, getting the running backs involved in the pass game, the Rams were doing that last year and doing it vertically, using these guys on some wheel routes and things. That could be something that I'm, not playing as well. But I mentioned the running back target numbers aren't huge, but if the targets are valuable, if there's the potential for chunk plays in the pass game, that's pretty huge.
The wide receiver room here, led by Puka Nacua and Davante Adams, and then it's kind of a trio of throw-ins after that. In terms of projections here, we have Puka at 148 targets, Gretch is at 173, and then Davante Adams, we were at 114.5 targets, Gretch is at 96. So pretty massive gap there. Davante is a guy I have been taking a ton. There's certainly some age concerns there, but he was 7th overall in the NFL in targets per run. Last year was Davante Adams. Puka Nacua first in the NFL in targets per outrun. So just elite concentration of targets here on the Rams' top 2 guys. Jack and I have been talking through this throughout the offseason, and Puka is a guy that and Jack, you can hit on this too. Like when we first started out, he was like the clear 101 for us with the amount of targets we gave him. It's just his per route metrics are out of control. So Jack, toss it to you and take us through your thoughts on Puka, and then Davante as well, who we have been well above market on this offseason so far.
Yeah, I'll start with Puka, and then I want to kick it to Gretch for Davante, just since he's quite a bit lower than us. So I want him to talk about that. But yeah, the Puka stuff is, when he's on the field, it's just ridiculous. 0.37 targets per out run, 9.9 yards per target. When I did these projections originally in like February, just doing a first run, I had Puka as our 101 by like a landslide, especially on DraftKings, and then kind of dialed it back, getting more feedback from everyone else on the team. And we do kind of.
But is that feedback mostly that like he might be crazy off the field, or is it about
we do have a little bit of that baked in. We mentioned it with the Rashee Rice stuff, the idiot tax. We have not as much as Rashee because he hasn't had quite the legal troubles, but we do have a little bit of both an injury tax because he's left so many games early, as well as kind of the idiot tax for some of the off-field shenanigans. So we have dialed it back on Puka. But if you purely project out the numbers from when he's on the field, it's truly ridiculous. And he could be the most valuable player in fantasy when he's on the field.
Yeah, we'll get to JSN later this pod, but like the top 3, Puka, JSN, and Ja'Marr Chase, we all have projected very, very close. And I think it's like, just in fantasy drafts right now, the top 5 with those 3 wide receivers, as long as Bijan and Gibbs, I think the top 5 is just kind of an awesome spot to be this season. Like I would be pumped with Puka or JSN, Chase, you know, any of those top three wide receivers. I think it's kind of hard to parse between the three, and all are great picks. But yeah, Gretch, take it away on Davante. And you came in about 20 targets less than us on Davante, and typically you skew, a little bit more optimistic. So pretty massive gap there.
Yeah, and I do want to just note on Puka. I came in with him as my clear number one wide receiver in the projections, and I think I'm just going to play it that way personally. Like in some of the higher stakes seasonal stuff that I do, as far as I'm concerned, because I mean, I think it's one of these things of where upside is so massive in fantasy. As far as I'm concerned, Puka is the guy where, like, if he can stay healthy, he can do things statistically that are unreachable by any other wide receivers. Since 2006, minimum of 200 routes, his 34.6% targets per out run last year was the third highest among any player. His 2024 targets per out run was number one on that list. So his last two seasons are top three in the last 20 years. He's sometimes limited on routes because of health, but when he's on the field, he's earning so much volume per route. And then the other part of this is, like, they are very rotational with some of the tight end stuff and everything, but they don't have a lot of talent behind him. And so we can talk about Adams. Adams is getting up there in age, right? Like, he'll be 33 for most of the season, turning 34 in December. And we've already seen the age-related decline, in my opinion. The targets per out run still very strong, as you mentioned. The yards per target has now been really poor for 3 straight years. In 2024, it rebounded a little bit. That was the year that he got traded midseason back to the Jets, and he had a couple long touchdowns that were like broken plays. I thought it was a little bit more fluky, and I kind of made note of it because the yards per target wasn't all the way back to like his career seasons, even with some of these explosive plays. It was still down. And the years sandwiching it, 2023, 2025, have been really pretty poor on the yards per target side. And then early in the offseason, they were talking about potentially wanting to move on from him. They basically, my understanding is, they told him they were thinking about a trade. That kind of gets out in the public sphere. His agent's going to find out. Sources are going to find out. That's going to get known. But they wanted to be fair to this veteran they have a lot of respect for. But they basically were trying to move on from him. They were kicking the tires on A.J. Brown and some other things. My read is, like, Adams' red zone prowess masked not only age-related decline, but also how some of his elements of his offense, like, they weren't a big hit for the Rams' offense. They did a lot of vertical air yard stuff with him. His ADOT was really high, and he just wasn't good downfield. Like, he was actually really pretty poor. He had over 1,500 air yards. He had 789 actual yards. Like, just not. To me, it's a little bit like Cooper Kupp a couple years ago, where they really loved the player. They eventually just phased him out, and I think they're there with Adams. I don't have Adams being completely phased out or anything. I still have him clearly ahead of, like, a lot of the other rotational bits, but I see him as more situational this year, or as them seeing him as more situational this year. And one of the notes I had when I was kind of going through this and doing a write-up on it as well is just trying to think about who would benefit from that. And I don't have a clear answer at wide receiver. And I don't have a clear answer at tight end either, but Terrence Ferguson had a really high ADOT, and we'll get to him. But, like, there's some minor optimism that he could potentially be a little bit more of a vertical thing. There's going to be air yards and a vertical role available. Xavier Smith had a little bit of a role, but he's like 29. He had, like, some interesting efficiency last year in a limited role, and he's a burner, but he's like an older dude who's been around the block.
Yeah, last year when Devontae was out, they said like Kanata Mumfield was going to be in like the Devontae Adams role, which is a little bit hyperbole, but he did end up kind of replicating that deployment a little bit. So maybe Mumfield, who is quite a bit younger,
but he was like
Xavier
super
Smith,
inefficient, is the issue,
for sure, for sure. So
I do want to push back on the yards per target a little bit from 2025 specifically, not the prior years, but Devontae led the league in targets from inside the 10-yard line with 23. That was 3 clear of the next closest player, even though he only had 114 targets. I don't know how many of those were like inside the 5, but just watching it seemed like a lot. I mean, those are targets where the best possible outcome is like a 3-yard touchdown, which is going to artificially push down the yards per target a bit.
That's a great point.
Yeah,
but it is quite a bit lower still than it is a great point. Well,
for sure. And the touchdowns can mask like the inefficiency a little bit, and that is a spot where like is that what regresses with Stafford and the Rams and Devontae this year? Like, does it kind of hit them in that way with Devontae leading the NFL in targets inside the 10? Like, how many opportunities will they have inside the 10 to throw to Devontae? Maybe that can get dialed back, as well as just like his effectiveness on those routes. And I do it is his deployment last year in terms of like pretty much career high ADOT, or at least since 2018 when we can track this stuff, and career high ADOT, and then a very low catch rate as well. Like, I wonder if there's a bit of a I don't know, correction to that this year, where they or if that's just kind of how they want to deploy Devontae.
Part of it is like this dude's it's gonna be 34 during the season this year. Like I remember like a couple years ago, Dwayne McFarland wrote a good piece on Devontae Adams, how like his production started getting more shaky and like he was on the decline. We're 3 years beyond that, or two years beyond that, where and the efficiency last year with the touchdowns was really, really strong. It just, to me, it feels very small hit, big miss. It's interesting that we both have the same number of receiving TDs, where I have a lot fewer targets. So I kept the receiving TD rate a little higher than you guys. Like, I didn't know how much to regress that. I do still think he's going to probably be used in that specific way. I think he's going to lose a lot of the air yards. And I feel like that was the other side of the yards per target thing, is like he had I look at depth adjusted efficiency when I do my projections, and he had like a really high ADOT. And so his depth adjusted yards per target was really pretty poor, right? Even though I think Jack's adjustment makes a lot of sense with the touchdown side of things and the red zone stuff. But yeah, and so then it gets back to Puka, right? If it's not Adams, if you're buying my perspective on this, it sort of has to be Puka, right? Like he has to do everything that he can handle. Everything else in this offense, I think there will be other production in this offense, but everything else in this offense is a little tough to play, because it's going to be, or it looks like it's going to be, very situational. I talked about how like 12 guys had 100 plus routes, and like 10 of them had like 23 or more targets or whatever it was. We talked about some other teams where like the sixth guy on the team was at like 16 targets. I mean, that's like, when I think of concentration, I think of like the five, well, there's different types of concentration, certainly, but like the 5 eligible receivers, how much are you just keeping those same 5 guys out there the whole time and like no one else rotates in? Or do you have 10 dudes that are getting 20 plus targets? Like, that doesn't seem like a lot, but when you go through a projection, you start to project 4 tight ends for 20 plus targets. Like, that cuts into the ability for like a third guy to do anything, or even potentially a second guy, which is kind of where I come with Adams. Is I'm higher than you guys on Xavier Smith. I'm higher than you guys on Jordan Whittington. I'm higher than you guys on Kanata Mumfield. Like, that doesn't mean that I'm like drafting those guys, but I do have more targets going to these rotational packages and usages that I think the Rams may do more of this year.
And I don't think it's necessarily worth talking through the rest of the wide receiver room here for fantasy purposes. Gretch mentioned he is a bit higher on Smith, Whittington, and Mumfield, and I do think that's just kind of directly correlated to our Devontae Adams difference there as well. But I do want to get into the tight end room a bit here, because the Rams obviously led the league in the NFL led the league last year with 30% deployment of 13 personnel. But it was funny because they didn't really run any 12 personnel. Only 9% 12 personnel all season, 31% 13 personnel. Just kind of interesting that they just didn't really go with the 2 tight end set much at all, and straight to the 3 tight ends. So sure enough, they had to bolster that room and drafted Max Clare this year on top of having a room of Terrence Ferguson, Tyler Higbee, Colby Parkinson, and Davis Allen here. So 5 legit bodies to deal with. Colby Parkinson was kind of the one that emerged down the stretch of last season. Tyler Higbee was kind of like the tight end one in role to start the year. He got hurt. Colby Parkinson ended up taking more of the inline role. And then Terrence Ferguson was just, man, I don't know if I've ever seen a profile like this at tight end before. We have him close to an 18-yard ADOT on 31 targets last year. He was slaughter out wide 70% of the time, only inline, 28.5% of the time there was Terrence Ferguson. So I almost view him as like a glorified, wide receiver 3 for the Rams here. So he's probably the one I'm most excited about in fantasy this year. But Colby Parkinson also had an amazing touchdown rate. He's a massive dude, 6'7", 265, their highest paid tight end as well. So I think Parkinson and Ferguson can have some value, but it is tough to distribute touches here. Jack, how are you viewing this Rams tight end room as we head into the upcoming season?
Yeah, so when the Rams drafted Claire, Nate Atkins, their beat writer over at The Athletic, said that they are hoping he basically redshirts this year and is a larger factor in a year, which I think makes sense. And although Claire and Ferguson are very different players, you mentioned the utilization for Ferguson and the monster ADOT, I think maybe that's what the Rams basically had in mind for Ferguson last year. And there have been multiple reports this offseason that they basically want Ferguson to take on a bigger role. He was only at 0.16 targets per outrun as a rookie, but he was efficient with 9.2 yards per target. And even that targets per outrun, given his ADOT, isn't that bad. He scored 3 touchdowns on 25 targets. So we've been ahead of market on Ferguson all offseason. We recently bumped him actually within the last week or two as well. So I think if you're looking for a breakout, I think he's the one to look for. I think the Rams really want him to take a step forward, and they're hoping that he can. I think that the runway is open, and now it's up to him to basically seize that opportunity. And the Rams are hoping that he establishes himself as the clear lead tight end here.
We're super aligned here. This was the one guy that I wanted to highlight among the ancillary pieces as the dude that I wanted to have action on. McVay in February said he's got the ability to basically play every skill position on our offense. That's every receiver spot. That's every tight end spot. He started with receiver. Like you just talked about, Dank. They couldn't find the wide receiver in like transactions they wanted where they would maybe trade Adams and acquire AJ Brown. They didn't acquire any new receivers. They end up drafting another second round tight end. I mean, we always talk about, oh, this tight end's maybe going to be treated like a wide receiver or whatever. I really like, I think they like Mumfield, Whittington, Xavier Smith, whatever, fine. I do think they're thinking we're going to have a lot more tight ends active on game day, and Terrence Ferguson's ability to basically play these wide receiver positions allows us flexibility to continue to do big tight end packages, et cetera. Because they use Parkinson, they use Higbee, and they use Davis Allen in addition to Claire. Like, they didn't need a fifth tight end. Even if Claire's a redshirt, you still have four other ones. Davis Allen played a meaningful amount last year. He's one of the guys that got targets on this team. He had 33 targets last year, Davis Allen. We don't even have him on our comparison sheet as one of the top four tight ends. I mean, it's like it's a crazy thing here, but the really high ADOT that you mentioned to me is really intriguing from the perspective that, again, Devontae Adams had 1,500 air yards and just didn't seem to have the ability at age 32 going into 33 last year to consistently make the plays vertically that they were viewing for him. And then it's not that Ferguson's going to line up and run the same routes as Adams, but you design different types of plays. You can run routes from different areas. I always think about it in terms of how different route combinations attack depths of the field. They're going to use Ferguson to attack vertically. And then potentially you use him also in the short and intermediate ranges as you make that multiple and you make that less predictable that when he's on the field, he's the deep option. It's a low probability bet. I do think there's a potentially really high ceiling here if his versatility is like the next evolution of this offense that we've been talking about. He could be like, it's blasphemy to be like, remember when Puka Nacua was a 6th round rookie and then suddenly got 190 targets or whatever as a rookie? But like, remember when Kyron Williams in year 2, like Cam Akers was the lead running back, and then by week 2, Kyron was the lead guy? Like, Sean McVay has kept things close to the chest, but you hear the little buzz like we're hearing about Ferguson right now, and then the season starts and it's like, oh, they just have a really big like role envisioned for this guy and how they're going to utilize him. Again, I don't know that like this is definitely going to happen. Again, I think it's a low probability bet. There's probably a really low floor here as well where he gets like 20 targets, but I mean, seems fun.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point on the Kyron and Puka breakouts. And probably one to kind of keep your ear to the ground during training camp, because those were both cases where kind of, May, June, it was a little bit of buzz, but nothing crazy. And then August, September rolls around and all of a sudden the buzz gets really out of control. And by week 1, like, we know that these guys are going to have super legitimate roles. So I'm curious if that kind of evolution also plays out with Ferguson.
Even the Blake Corum thing last year, we got a little bit of buzz and they were like, they're excited about him. And it was like, are we really going to pay attention to this? They didn't use him at all last year. That's what we're at. You are here on Terrence Ferguson's timeline. Doesn't mean we're going there, but that's where we're at. It seems crazy because he didn't do very much last year. But I agree with you guys that Parkinson is really interesting too, as the more like the best, more traditional tight end. And I have him like, he was really efficient last year. I have him looking pretty good, just not on a ton of targets. But yeah, I think like both Parkinson and Ferguson could potentially coexist if this is sort of the scenario. It's just tricky because, Higbee, if he's active, will get some targets. Davis Allen in his role will probably get some targets, and just like how they use different guys. And they'll still do some 11 personnel. They'll still get other receivers on the field. But yeah, the optimism for Ferguson and Parkinson, and I really do think they're going to do a lot of the multi-tight end stuff. We talked about how like not every team's going to do that. McVay had the quote, "We'll see how it goes." A little bit later in the summer, he was like, "Yeah, we're going to do a lot of that." Like he basically was like, "That's what our roster is. That's where we're headed." So again, that ties right back into my pessimism for Adams, is just kind of deprioritizing the rest of the receivers as they focus on their versatility at tight end.
One note on Parkinson, he had 36% of his targets came inside the red zone. He had more red zone targets than Puka last year. So, certainly that's where they're looking for Colby Parkinson. And he's essentially free right now in best ball drafts. Like, even if Terrence Ferguson does break out, I think Parkinson's still going to have that inline, probably red zone role a little bit as well. So I think he's an interesting kind of just, end of draft free stack partner in redraft fantasy. I'm not sure he'll necessarily be that, but he had that stretch last year where he scored 6 touchdowns in 6 games. And I remember going into the fantasy semis, they played Seattle on that Thursday night, and I was getting just like so many texts like, do I start Colby Parkinson this week? Like he's amazing. Like, he's crushing it. And then he posted 2 for 21, no touchdowns in that game and let the whole fantasy community down. But certainly could run back the touchdown production this year, I think. All right, let's move along to the San Francisco 49ers here. Always one of the most exciting offenses to talk about in the NFL. Kyle Shanahan remains at the helm here once again for another season. Brock Purdy should be back at full strength after missing parts of last year due to a turf toe injury there. On a team level, we are pretty aligned here in terms of plays per game. We are at 61.9 in ETR. Gretch is at 61.8. In terms of pass rate, we are at 59.4%. Gretch at 58.5% here. On a team level, I did want to note that last year they had the 6th fastest neutral pace last season, but that the pace was way different under Mac Jones than it was under Brock Purdy. In 2024 and 2023, they were dead last in neutral pace when Purdy started 15 and 16 games. And kind of when you look at the breakdown from last season, just between when the 2 quarterbacks started, it was a massive difference there once again. And then just in terms of like the unique personnel, the 49ers have led the NFL in 21 personnel, which is 2 backs, 1 tight end on the field each of the last 2 seasons. A lot of that comes with obviously Christian McCaffrey in the pass game, but also Kyle Juszczyk out there is kind of used as a chess piece. So not necessarily like the traditional heavier tight end sets, but we do get some different personnel looks here from the 49ers. So Jack, curious your thoughts on the play calling here for San Francisco. Obviously a decent amount of continuity, but I do think the quarterback, or at least Brock Purdy being in there and kind of the split we saw between him and Mac Jones last year were notable.
Yeah, I kind of think we have a good idea of what to expect with Shanahan and Purdy, so I'm not super surprised that Gretchen and us have pretty similar projections here. The Mac Jones starts did, I believe, coincide with their defense completely falling apart, and then it kind of figured it out a little bit near the end, so I wonder if that had something to do with the pace, where their defense was just getting scored on so easily that they played a little bit faster. I think the big thing, if we trickle down from the team level into Purdy, is the scramble rate uptick that he's had over his career. He started with a 3.5 and 3.9% scramble rate the last 2 years. He's been 8.2% and 6.5%. So a lot more running over the past 2 years. That's led to him being a more interesting fantasy option, and it seems like it's something that's here to stay.
And his sack rate cratered last year, which was really optimistic, in addition to the scrambling being higher. If you look at some like EPA based stuff, he was really good last year. He didn't play a ton, but like if you go to runningbacksdon'tmatter.com, rbsdm.com, Ben Baldwin's site, 3rd best in EPA per play last year. Even losing EPA he actually had a really high interception rate last year, so you're going to lose EPA on that. But he was 2nd best completion percentage over expected as well among qualified QBs. Had the top success rate on dropbacks of any QB, just ahead of May and well ahead of Stafford as the QB3, and then the rest of the QBs behind Stafford. And that gets back to that sack rate being down, but still being able to scramble is a tricky thing. If you're holding the ball, like how are you navigating the pocket? Definitely some impressive improvement in Purdy as they've put more on him. Like a couple years ago when he was like first being talked about as like an MVP candidate, I thought it was fascinating that like defenses were putting more guys in the box and trying to take away McCaffrey and like Deebo Samuel at the time and making Purdy beat them. And I thought that was this like huge like dichotomy between him supposedly being the most valuable player in the league and not even defenses don't even think they think he's the liability in the offense. And Brandon Ayuk had the huge year because he was getting one-on-ones downfield and Purdy was taking advantage of it and he was hitting on those plays. They've put more on Purdy's shoulders these last couple of years, obviously with CMC being such a talented receiving back. When he's on the field, they were closer to neutral in PROE last year while the league shifted toward negative. Like they're throwing to him out of the backfield a lot more than maybe they're trying. Like he still ran a ton, obviously CMC, but this is not like your your dad's Kyle Shanahan offense that would be negative 6% PROE. This is putting more on Purdy's shoulders, and he was good. He was good.
He was, and this is very bird's eye view, and he only played 9 games, and it's easier to have outlier level statistical performances and when you're playing less than a full season. But he was the QB2 by fantasy points per game, so very legit production out of Purdy last year.
I don't think the rushing gets talked about enough with Purdy specifically, so I'm glad you brought that up, Jack, because in the last 2 seasons, he's averaged 20 rush yards per game. He also has 8 rushing touchdowns, so he's averaged 4 points per game on the ground over the last 2 years, which is, a massive boost to quarterback scoring, and then you get the typical efficiency out of a Kyle Shanahan offense, and that really compounds, and we saw Brock Purdy essentially be the winning quarterback for Sam Sherman, who took down the $2 million top prize on Underdog last year. Just absolutely went nuts in the fantasy playoffs there. So Purdy was someone I was really high on last year, and we were as well, just like at ETR. And once again, we are above market on Purdy there. I don't think people are fully factoring in kind of the added fantasy bonus that he gives with his legs these days. All right, let's get into the backfield here. Christian McCaffrey, obviously, headlines as coming off another overall RB1 fantasy performance. Did CMC, the rushing efficiency, I feel like, has been the biggest talking point on McCaffrey this offseason, dipped down to 3.9 yards per carry the last 2 seasons. But the receiving game is really what unlocks CMC here. In terms of projections, we are at 212 carries on CMC. Gretch is at 268. We're at 79 targets. Gretch is at 107. So just a massive volume gap there. And CMC is one of the toughest players to project, I think, just because it's akin to the Puka situation where it's like, man, if we really lean into the per down or per rate stats, like CMC would project, I think, as the clear 101 for us, almost every season. But he is coming off of close to a 400 touch season, entering age 30. So it's a little bit of a tough breakdown, but Gretch, you are a little bit more optimistic there. Curious your thoughts on CMC coming off his massive RB1 season.
Yeah, 517 routes by PFF last year, 80 more routes than any other running back, most for a running back since CMC himself in 2019. It was his 6th season over 400. That's all the 6 years where he's played at least 8 games. So it's not even like that crazy of an outlier for him to get to 517. He's done this before. Basically, no one else does it. He's just different. You read Shanahan's quotes this offseason, and shout out Coach Speak Index as always. It seems like he never really considered how much he was using CMC. It kind of sees with hindsight that it's crazy that he used him that much and that he actually stayed healthy and didn't get hurt. And he's kind of like, yeah, I understand why you guys are asking me this question. I didn't really think about it. At one point he talked about you send a play in and it's specific to having CMC on the field, and you realize the backup running backs out there, and now you're left with the option of calling a timeout or letting them run a play that they can't execute, because he's talking about how his game plan is built through the dynamism of his running back, and no one else has that on the roster. And so you're kind of screwed. But he led the league in touches again with 413 touches in his age 29 season. He has 37 in the postseason for 450 total. A lot of people say we overstate this stuff. I mean, the year after he had tendonitis issues in his Achilles, and I've had tendonitis in my shoulder, that stuff comes back. This is not a thing that goes away for forever. Obviously he's got a lot more ways to cope with this stuff and deal with this stuff, but he's going into his age 30 season now. I think he turned 30 here in June, and you're talking about a lot of touches. The last 2 times, I mean, this is not, I'm not saying he's definitely going to get hurt, but the last 2 times he led the league in touches and went over 2,000 yards, he played a combined 7 games in the N+1 seasons. We know this about him. He's had season-ending injuries as well. I don't know how to project him. You guys, are kind of doing it with a pretty big injury doc, which is probably the right way to do it to hit on the different range of outcomes and the probabilities here. But at the same time, I know you guys, like you said, Mark, don't think that this is what his full season would look like if he's healthy. It's just an element of splitting the 2 possibilities, which one of the possibilities is that he's just out for the entire year. I want to believe that he's not going to do that. I will say his rushing efficiency was not quite the same. His 1.79 yards per out run, right in his prime, still an awesome pass catcher, had an actual vertical ADOT. Just talked about running back air yards. He's been around 3 both the last 2 years because he runs routes. He's a freaking slot receiver. He splits out and he runs at guys and runs these option routes like Wes Welker. He's doing all of that stuff. So he's going to have a higher yards per target than most running backs. He can carry a yards per out run that's close to 2, but also his like missed tackles forced per reception, his yak per reception, those are not declining or anything. He still looks really good in space when he gets the ball. Again, 29 last year. I don't think like you can't continue to produce at age 30 or anything like that. It's a really impossible thing to figure out. Like, what do you do? Like last year, the whole fantasy market was probably too low on Christian McCaffrey. We're taking him in the same range this year because he's just a year older and he's coming off a ton of touches. Like, what does that mean?
Right.
Yeah, so
it really is. It really is more of an art than a science. Last year, McCaffrey had a 22.5% target share, 74% designed rush share. We're at a 15.5% target share and a 52% design carry share. So those are massive deviations from where he was last year. But in terms of why we have him at exactly 15.5 or exactly 52%, it's kind of just a feel thing on how much we want to adjust for age, for workload, for injury. It's not like we have. It's not an exact science in knowing how much from his previous year workload we should detract. And if we did project him anywhere close to what he was last year, he'd be the clear 101, or at least if we were projecting everyone that way, he'd be right there with Puka in this world where there's no risk. But yeah, so it really is difficult to project McCaffrey because the workload is just so monstrous, and it's so unclear how much to take away from that to account for the age and the injury risks.
McCaffrey scored 21.5 half PPR points per game last year. 10.9 of those came from as a receiver and 10.6 came as a rusher. So the 10.9 half PPR points per game, if you compare that just to the wide receivers, that would make him the wide receiver 17 overall. He scored ahead of guys like Cortland Sutton, Alec Pierce, DK Metcalf, Tet McMillan last year, just as a receiver alone. So
that's the insane thing where it's like you kind of want them to take like a lot of rushing off of his plate because you know that the versatility with the receiving is so strong. You don't need a lot of rushing and he'd still be so good in fantasy.
All you want is the goal line roll for him. And you know, so I did like, and I feel like people are claiming, oh, his like rushing efficiency dipping last year is like a sign of a downturn. It's like, I don't care about his rushing efficiency, like honestly at all. Even if you made him a 3.0 yards per carry guy last season, he still would have tied Jonathan Taylor as with 21 points per game as you know as a fantasy scorer, just given his receiving output. So I almost don't really care about the rushing efficiency output. Obviously, like, you know, if he's more efficient as a rusher, that's going to lead to more first downs, more yardage, more opportunities, you know, in theory. But it's really just if the receiving role can stand for CMC, that's really what unlocks him as like the best running back in fantasy.
102 catches last year, 129 targets. I got him down to 107 targets in my projection. You guys have him, as you mentioned, at 79, which is, I mean, not really assuming like a 17 game, like the route stuff that I was just saying is like, he's going to run 450 routes if he plays 17 games and no other running back in the league will get close. It's like, anyway, it's impossible. Right. Like, what do you do?
Just to showcase a little bit of how ridiculous CMC's workload is, we have his workload regressed as much as I just said, and we're still a spot ahead of underdog ADP.
Yeah, it's insane. Let's talk about the backups here because, you know, we are mentioning the high injury risk with CMC, especially coming off this high touch season. And last year, the backups hardly got any work. And you know, one of the, I guess, minor storylines of the draft was the 49ers selecting Kalen Black in the third round, who, you know, wasn't even invited to the combine yet. The 49ers said they had Black as their second rated running back on the board. So he was a massive surprise pick in the third round. They also have Jordan James returning to the roster this year. He was a 5th round pick in 2025. And then Isaac Grendo remains on the roster as well. So I kind of want to get into a discussion on mostly Jordan James versus Kalen Black as the RB2 here. I've kind of personally been leaning Jordan James. He just had the much better collegiate profile. He's actually a pass catcher in college. He caught 41 balls in 28 games at Oregon. Meanwhile, Kalen Black had 8 catches in 29 career games at Indiana. And again, just consensus on him as a prospect was pretty low. So Gretch, I'm curious your thoughts on the backups here. And if, you know, if you would lean one way or the other as a potential handcuff for CMC right now.
I sort of didn't. I just projected him for the exact same amount of rushes. And then I have Grendo very low. I guess he like tore his pec in like weightlifting and
He did,
but
yes. That's a great note. So he's probably going to miss almost all of training camp and maybe bleed into the season as well.
And so the fact that they didn't use him at all last year was so weird to me, because if you go back to the rookie season, he was really efficient. They've struggled to find a good backup, and the different guys they've drafted have not necessarily been good, and they haven't played him. They played Guerrero quite a bit in 2024 in his rookie year. He's like 5+ yards per carry and like very efficient as a receiver too, like 7 point something yards per target. I don't have it right in front of me, but the average for a running back is about 6. I mean, he looked really, really strong. 5 yards per carry, he's 9.5 yards per target, way above the average for a running back. His per touch efficiency was through the roof. There was a Shanahan quote this offseason that he had quote in late March. I always thought that Isaac would come in and take over the game plan if Christian got hurt, but Christian stayed healthy all year, because they were talking about the receiving stuff and like how he can play in the receiving game. And it was like, oh, he's the guy that you see as the handcuff to do all the dynamic stuff that McCaffrey does, because they had Brian Robinson as this like rusher only. When they talked about Black's receiving, when asked about it, Shanny comps him to Elijah Mitchell and Jordan Mason and says that, it was kind of like those guys who didn't do a lot with receiving, but they got a lot better. Not great company in that regard, that he starts with guys that are like, he's like, yeah, but you guys don't realize they were doing really good behind the scenes. So they basically said that he's not a receiver. He had only 8 catches in 2 years at Indiana. He did have some receiving early in his career at James Madison before transferring. But as you noted, the peripheral is just okay. He does have good athleticism, but like, I don't know what he's supposed to be. His breakaway rate was like better than some of the evasion stuff indicates. So I think they think he just like hits the right hole and doesn't waste movement and it actually gets downhill, which is fine. But like, I don't know, man. Like they like him. Obviously they drafted him. They already had Jordan James on the roster. They like him. They talk about him favorably. To your point, James does have a little bit more intrigue in the prospect profile. I think, if it's me, but I don't know what Kyle Shanahan's doing with running backs ever. But if it's me, Isaac Guerrero is the one that looked the most interesting when you got him on the field a couple of years ago. Now he's hurt, so that's not going to help him out. But I don't really know what to make of Jordan James and Kalen Black. I'm taking notes that you're more interested in Jordan James. I think that's a good note.
I think generally just I try to lean more into like second year or more experienced players too than the rookies. And your Guerrero quote, I love that you brought that up from the Coach Week Index, just because I thought that was really interesting, because a lot of times we see like running backs that have the RB2 role in the offense. If the starter were to go down, almost like the RB3 in line would kind of usurp them for that running back 1 role. And I think like Kalen Black may get more touches early on than Jordan James. Like he might be kind of that bruiser Brian Robinson role that we saw last year to handle, 5 to 8 carries a game or something. But then if CMC went down, I kind of think Jordan James probably fits the profile better to be more of the everyday, or handle the pass down work and then get some carries on top of that. So I just think probably the upside there as a handcuff with James is a little more exciting to me, rather than like expecting Kalen Black to have a receiving profile kind of come out of nowhere.
Yeah, we have Guerrero for 24 carries. Gretch only has him for 2. That Guerrero usage is basically just as a proxy for RB4. Like, I think there's a decent chance Guerrero ends up getting cut. It's just that he's currently on the roster, so we are projecting him as like some unlisted RB4 type. I also lean Jordan James. Like Gretch said, Kalen Black was basically a 0 as a pass catcher in college, 12 targets in 29 games at Indiana. Despite the difference in draft capital, James was a better prospect, I think, even if the 49ers seem to disagree. And Shanahan in the past has had basically no problem ignoring draft capital at running back. You've got TDP, you've got Trey Sermon. I think there was one even before that, like Joe Williams or something, who just never even played. So I'm kind of leaning into the guy who has a year of experience in the system, who was a better prospect, who's a better pass catcher by default, basically. So I do think this is one to watch in camp, and I'm very open to being wrong here. I think that if we get reports early in camp that Black's the RB2, we're going to adjust fast. But if we're playing with the information we have now, I lean James as the RB2.
Part of the reason we have to talk about this, though, and part of the reason I was kind of leaning Black, is they went and drafted Black, and they already didn't give James a single touch for his entire rookie year. No, we talked, some of this is the CMC thing. We talked about some other teams where like the third running backs didn't get much work. There was no third running back who got a carry in this offense. Kyle Juszczyk got 2 if you want to bring the fullback in, but it was CMC and Brian Robinson, who's now gone. They didn't give Garendo a touch all year. They didn't give Jordan James a touch all year. At any point in any garbage time, it's really bizarre to see two running backs, like true running backs, get touches all season long. But that's what they did. They didn't give this guy a single play. Like, it's just, was he inactive most of the year? Do you guys remember?
He played. He played on special teams in the last I think 3 games, and then in the playoffs as well. But yeah, he did get a touch in the playoffs in that blowout loss, but did not get one in the regular season. So I think it was the last 3 games of the regular season he played special teams, and then in the playoffs as well, he was getting some special team snaps. Was Jordan
7
James.
touches in a 41-6 loss to the Seahawks. They were getting him some work. I missed that.
I can't believe you don't remember that. Yeah, that's insane, Gretch. All right, let's go to the wide receiver room here, headlined by Mike Evans coming over from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You also have Ricky Pearsall entering his 3rd season. Deshaun Stribling, another kind of surprise. Well, less of a surprise than Kalen Black, but a little bit of a surprise at the top of the 2nd round. They take Deshaun Stribling there, and then Christian Kirk.
Yeah, but if you ask them, they'll tell you that they heard that there's some teams that had Stribling number 1 on their board. Yeah, wide receiver.
100%. And then Christian Kirk here, 1 year, $3 million deal. They have Demarcus Robinson in the room as well. So relatively deep wide receiver room here. I think, all these guys kind of have some question marks one way or another, but let's start with Mike Evans. In terms of projections at ETR, we're at 97 targets, Gretch at 113. So this is one I've been struggling with. And like, obviously Mike Evans' season last year was cut short, but he did play at least 13 games in every season of his career. I feel like he kind of gets labeled as injury prone, but he hasn't missed significant time before last year. Obviously that helped contribute to his 11 straight 1,000-yard seasons to start his career as well. So when I was looking at this, I was like, man, are we discounting Mike Evans too much because of the injury that he suffered last year? He still had pretty elite target per route run numbers, 29% last season. It was 29% in 2024 and 26% in 2023 as well. So you do have he is going to be 33 in August. You do have the little bit of age concern that, we hit on with Devontae Adams as well. So I think we might be light here, but Jack, curious your thoughts on Mike Evans as he transfers over to the 49ers here.
Yeah, well, he has the age concerns we mentioned with Devontae Adams, but he also has the yards per target concerns that we mentioned with Adams. It's not as much of a multi-year trend as it was with Adams, but he was at just 5.9 yards per target last year. He was terrific at earning targets, like you said, 0.29 targets per out run, but under 6 yards per target is really bad. The injuries have started piling up over the past 2 seasons, and it was a hamstring in 2024, which we know has a decent recurrence rate. I certainly think there's reasons to be optimistic about Evans. The red zone role should be really terrific here in one of the better offenses in the league. And the target competition at receiver, at least, is nothing special. But I do think that there's reasons to not be mega enthused about him, just given the downturn in yards per target last season.
Yeah, I didn't know where to get his volume to. You mentioned the really high targets per out. The other thing about him versus Adams is he's brought in this year. And like last year, we saw Adams get 1,500 air yards. When they bring in a guy like that, they're like, we're going to make him a focal point. Like they sold him on something to lure him away from the box. They paid him. Like there's intent. I share your concerns about the yards per target cratering and his career low 1.62 yards per out run. And he's age 33. When we talk about Purdy, though, another thing I want to note is like his TD rate could spike with Evans there. It almost feels like Shanahan copying McVay's Devontae Adams move for more red zone answers. There, we talk about that from a fantasy lens of it being sort of gimmicky or trying to get Stafford the MVP. It was efficient. You got to be good in the red zone. A lot of the modern NFL, we talked at the very top about with the increase in starting field position. A lot of the modern NFL is, can you turn 3s into 7s and get in the end zone? They lined up, and when they got one-on-ones on the outside, they said, you're our man beater, you'll beat him. Some of Shanahan's quotes on Evans this offseason were like, when you have a one-on-one with him, you just go to him. Like he's still way bigger than you. And that's kind of what Mike Evans' thing has always been. It's not the smoothness of the route running of Devontae Adams. It's that Mike Evans just like suns people. Like he just like beasts people. And that's what he's done his whole career. So, I mean, Purdy might wind up just like spiking the TD rate here. And I'm not probably going to take a lot of Evans. I don't usually take 33-year-old receivers, but I do get being optimistic here. One of the elements that was tricky for me with the volume as well is that Evans has always been a huge volume earner, as you guys mentioned, and continuing into last year. And one of the unique things about him is it's always been at a pretty high ADOT. And so you get the ton of air yards. You get high targets per route at a plus ADOT. Pearsall's optimism this offseason, if you're going, like, I was out on Pearsall on this show last year, and I felt like I got lucky that he got hurt a lot last year because he made some big strides. His targets per out run jumped from 14.4 as a rookie to 18.2. One of my concerns off the rookie year, even after, getting shot and everything else he dealt with, was that when he was out there, he got a lot fewer targets than Juwan Jennings. He really closed that gap in year 2 at a higher ADOT. So he had a yards per target jump as well. He jumped all the way to 1.85 yards per out run. But what I was so pumped about Pearsall is this Evans thing of, okay, your targets per out run is ticking up and you have a high ADOT. It's a lot of air yards. It has the potential for these splash plays. They're not going to play the same position or anything, but I do think there's some like overlap in those areas of the field. Whereas like a lot of the shorter targets are going to be McCaffrey, they're going to be Kittle when he's healthy, some of that stuff. Stribling, we're going to talk about as a ball in hand physical guy, is sort of the new Juwan Jennings, probably going to get some shorter stuff. But it looks to me like Pearsall and Evans, both are going to be guys that could command target at higher ADOTs. And it's tricky for Pearsall as well. I wanted to be in on Pearsall this year. I thought he was really overlooked in the early offseason, and now he's kind of stayed cheap because Evans ends up on the roster. But I thought he was overlooked early just because he didn't catch any touchdowns last year, but his yardage was very strong in like a per route stuff. Like I said, I think I was wrong on Pearsall last year, but the Evans Pearsall push and pull with the targets was tough for me. We have the gap sort of similar. I'm higher than you guys on both sides of it, but Evans being about 20 targets higher than Pearsall, it looks like it's the same for both of us. You guys have more for Stribling.
Yeah, we've been a little bit behind market on all of Evans, Pearsall, and Stribling in best ball at least, which, it's kind of tough there because you have Kittle and CMC who have been, huge target earners as well in the past. So it is a little tough to know. You mentioned just, Evans' proclivity to earn targets too. Like you have CMC, Mike Evans, George Kittle in an offense. It's kind of like, okay, how much can Pearsall realistically carve out there? So and then that
was my concern about Pearsall last year, and it's been the concern the last few years with the Niners. What's weird is with all the injuries, that wasn't a concern last year. Like it was, you had potentially Ayuk coming back. Obviously Debo was gone, but we wind up with 360 Kendrick Bourne routes and 263 from Demarcus Robinson last year, which is not they've been the opposite going in projection season going into the year. Like we've got too many great players coming in. They're kind of back to that though. I had a hard time fitting Evans into this projection.
For sure. And yeah, so inputs there, you're 16 targets ahead on Mike Evans. You're also, about 16 on Ricky Pearsall. And then we're 15 ahead on Dejon Stribling. We do have Christian Kirk for a similar amount of targets. We're 2 ahead on Kirk. And when I was kind of looking at this, I was like, man, I wonder if Kirk is almost going to play at all. You mentioned Deshaun Stribling, you think could kind of fit into that big slot role that Juwan Jennings has played in the Shanny system. And Pearsall also got 40% of his routes from the slot his rookie season too. So I kind of think it's, going to be a top 3. And then if there are any injuries, Kirk can slot in. So I was a little bit concerned, especially coming off a career worst yards per target for Christian Kirk, all the way down at 4.6 last year. I'm like, man, I almost wonder if Kirk is kind of buried here until there's an injury and we can condense on the top 4 or 5 guys here even more, because that's kind of how it goes with the 49ers, at least on like weekly DFS projections. Like, okay, how can we get all these targets to the top 5 guys? And then if someone's injured, it's like, okay, then it even condenses even more on whoever's healthy. Plus,
right,
you may
Shanahan,
get like a Demarcus Robinson or Kendrick Bourne or whatever that gets like 8 to 10% of the target share.
But then the one week, like Kendrick Bourne, when everyone was hurt last year, it's like Kendrick Bourne might be the guy that's going to get 10 targets. Because Shanahan like totally game plans that way. He thinks players, not plays, and he's like, all right, this is my guy for the week. I'm going to build everything around him. But yeah, I'm with you. Christian Kirk's yards per target so low last year. He just looks done to me. I love that you guys are higher than me on Stribling. I didn't know what to do there. I think it's an interesting way of doing it to have him a little higher and Evans and Pearsall a little lower. Stribling, good ball in hand stuff, physical guy, good yak, did enough through a long 5-year college stint to be interesting for me. I don't think he's a great prospect. I think people talked about him as a huge reach, and then they're overlooking some real possibility here as a result of that. They put draft capital into this dude, and I actually think he's like not nothing. Like back in Dynasty draft, rookie draft season, people were like completely out on him. You got a really good price on him relative to the draft capital because everyone was so convinced that they massively reached. The draft capital is what it is. Like they went and paid up for this dude, and they talked about him as being this physical blocker and can do the Juwan Jennings stuff. So it seems like he may play a little bit this rookie year. I like that you guys have him up over 50 targets. I got him at 36. We both have Kirk around like 40, low 40s. I think their best 3 receiver set's got to be Evans, Pearsall, and Stribling, though.
Right. We've talked about how these teams want to get their best players on the field and how the wide receiver role stuff can kind of evolve throughout the season. And I do think that that's worth bringing up because Evans and Pearsall have both played primarily outside. Stribling primarily played outside in college, and Dane Brugler even noted that he mostly just played on the left side at Ole Miss. Grant Cohn, who I know 49er fans don't really like him as a beat writer, but he wrote that he thinks Stribling is going to be on the field right away in the slot, which would push Christian Kirk out, which we all sound like are in agreement that makes the most sense after the horrifically inefficient season Kirk just had in Houston. So I think that there's a decent chance that Stribling does push Kirk right away for that slot role, and then you still have Evans and Pearsall on the outside as we expect.
And the one consensus on Stribling as a prospect was that he was, the best wide receiver blocker in the class as well. So that should help him hopefully get on the field. That's there, right. Despite his, his receiving profile, that was at least, a strong kind of consensus of, at least of the prospect analysts out there. All right, let's talk through the George Kittle of it all, who tore his Achilles this January 11th in the playoffs against the Eagles. He turns 33 in October this season. So, 33 coming off an Achilles injury. Mentioned on like the AFC West show about Aronde Gadsden's yards per target, kind of nearing George Kittle. He's at 10.0 yards per target in his career, just absolutely out of control. There is George Kittle in the efficiency market. Also has 38 touchdowns over his last 5 seasons. He's never been lower than the tight end 5 in points per game since his rookie season. So just been, an absolute model of consistency in the fantasy space. But again, did tear his Achilles on January 11th. He's someone we started out a bit lower on, expecting him to probably miss like a month of the season, but reports on him have been pretty strong. The Achilles tear is the cleanest Achilles tear of all time, apparently higher up in the calf. So it was an easier surgical repair for Kittle. And then he's also been out at tight end. He hosts this tight end U. He was out there doing some drills, seemed to be moving decently there and like, seemingly on track for week 1. So in terms of targets, we are dead even here at 77 targets on George Kittle. We're a bit higher on the yards per target at 9.0. Gretch is at 8.3 yards per target there. And this spot, I think, is going to be really hard just because, again, with the Achilles, you introduce a lot of, compensation injuries, I think are very common post Achilles as well. And then Kittle just 33. And what's made him such an elite NFL tight end is his explosiveness and yards after catch ability. And I think it's fair to question that coming off the Achilles. So Gretch, I'm curious your thoughts just here on Kittle, who again has been one of the best fantasy tight end scorers over the last decade or so. How do you view his outlook coming off this Achilles?
Yeah, I think you hit on everything. And there's people that are really excited about the injury return timeline. I think the one sort of framing that has stuck for me is it's not just when he gets back on the field, but can he be the same efficient player? You're talking about the 10.0 yards per target as a career number. I do think he'll have his moments, but I'm concerned in the first season off an Achilles that he's not going to be able to be the same guy. Last year's 9.1 yards per target was basically already a down season for him as well. I mean, he has 33. Now I'll be clear that at tight end 33 is not that old. I mean, there's like the elites have been able to produce, like Travis Kelce's last massive season was at 33. Tony Gonzalez did it till that late in his career. Guys like Antonio Gates had seasons that late in their career. It's definitely happened at this position. It doesn't take quite as much athleticism. It's more about like the nuance of some of the route running and some of these things. And Kittle, we know, can block really well and stay on the field and do all of that. I think he's going to play when he's healthy, and I don't think he's too old. But we did already start to see a little bit of a decline in his missed tackles forced and yak numbers just in the last year or two. And some of the ball in hand stuff, some of the yards per target maybe already starting to dip just a little bit before an Achilles injury. That's the part of it that I'm having a hard time with is like, can we expect him to come back and be George Kittle? Because the profile for him has always been, he doesn't get as many routes and as many targets as we want because he's such an elite blocker to the offense. But when he gets the targets, you get such elite per target efficiency. Are we going to get that is the big question.
Yeah, and his yards after catch per reception hit a career low last year, only 4.4. He's at a 7.7 on the dot for his career. So that dropped like 2.5 yards based on his career average. I'm certainly a little bit concerned there on Kittle. He's one of my favorite players in the league. I hope he comes back smoothly, but I know just post Achilles, like again, the compensation injuries can kind of stack up a little bit too. And so in that vein, if he does miss time, I did want to shout out Jake Tonjes here, who in 6 games without Kittle last year had 40 targets, 29 receptions, and 3 touchdowns. So a per game average there of 4.8 catches, 45 yards, and half a touchdown. That was good for 9.9 half PPR points per game, which, if you sent that over the full season, would have been the tight end 6 overall. So if Kittle does miss any time this year, I do think Jake Tonjes is pretty interesting, but he's an absolute zero when Kittle is in there. He had 2 catches for 9 yards in healthy Kittle games. So it's purely like a handcuff tight end scenario there, more for redraft leagues.
One stat note on Tonjes, well, more on Kittle. Even though Kittle was a little bit down in efficiency last year, I will note his yards per out run was about a full yard better than Tonjes. They both ran over 200 routes. Tonjes mostly was running those routes filling in for Kittle. You had these 2 different tight ends in the same offense in a very similar role. And Tonjes had some fantasy viability, right? But Kittle was that much more efficient, even in a down efficiency year, than his teammate that was in his, was his replacement when he was missing some time earlier in the year.
Yeah, I'll add that we've kind of been slowly bumping Kittle up as the progressive news continues, or positive news continues to trickle out. And I think that at his current price, it's a risk worth taking. On Underdog, the 2 tight ends going after him are Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews. So it's not like the market is really expecting Kittle to be himself. That's a significant discount from where we've seen Kittle go in his pre-injury years. And it sounds like he's going to be ready very early in the season. I know they play in Australia in week 1. I don't know if that'll complicate his availability for week 1 specifically. But it sounds like week 1, if not week 1, then probably week 2 at this point. And I think when he's going outside the top 100 in ADP, even with the concerns coming off the injury, the slightly decreased but still very good efficiency, I think it's a risk worth taking at the current cost.
Let's go to Seattle, where George Kittle's tight end coach from the last 4 seasons was just hired to be the offensive coordinator there. That is Brian Fleury. Certainly didn't know much about Fleury beforehand, so looked him up. He was a college quarterback, but was mostly a defensive coach when he entered the NFL in 2013. And then from 2014 to 2019, he was over on the defensive side of the ball, then switched over to offense and was the 49ers tight end coach for the last 4 seasons. He added run game coordinator title to his list last season. So Brian Fleury comes over to replace Clint Kubiak, who's in Las Vegas now as the head coach. Seahawks are an interesting team to discuss because they were very, very run heavy and pretty slow pace last year, despite JSN's breakout season. In terms of team level here at ETR, we're at 61.8 plays and a 57% pass rate. Gretch is at 60.6 plays and a 55% pass rate there. So, probably leaning a little bit more into last year with a little bit of lower play volume there for Gretch, as well as a lower pass rates. When Fleury was asked kind of how he's going to approach this offensive season, he said, quote, "It looks very similar to the one that just won the Super Bowl. One of the advantages of taking this job is that there's going to be a lot of continuity. I've already started to dive into everything that Clint Kubiak was doing here, and the goal would be to maintain as much of that as possible. There's also areas where we can supplement that with things that we've developed and done in San Francisco under Kyle Shanahan." So again, kind of limited background for Fleury. Hard to know exactly what to expect from him, Gretch. So toss it your way to see how you're approaching this. Do you believe Fleury in that he's just going to try and kind of replicate exactly or as much of what Kubiak did as possible last year?
Well, I think so, but I also think Mike Macdonald is a part of the equation here, where what was so interesting to me about Macdonald last year was after year 1, they didn't have a horrible offense. He fired his first offensive coordinator. He went out and got Clint Kubiak. He went out and got pieces that fit into that particular scheme. It seemed like there was a lot of intent from a guy who's thought of as this defensive wizard to build out what he thought was the right offensive next evolution and step and that's what we saw actually was with, a lot of different things across the league, but obviously Seattle's offense to go win a Super Bowl with Sam Darnold, and your, PROE is very low, 3rd lowest PROE, 5th lowest seconds per snap. They're basically trying to hide their quarterback most of the year. I'm not saying Darnold didn't play well, but I always thought it was very fascinating when people looked at like EPA per play stuff. And I'm like, yeah, they're running every single play. And he still ended up leading the league in giveaways, if I'm not mistaken. I think that was the stat that came up like in the postseason, even though they had that low of a PROE. And that was against an expected pass rate that was very low because they led in almost every single game. They were constantly ahead. He still had a lot of giveaways. He had some damn Sam Darnold moments, but they were able to build an offense that worked for him and took advantage of his strengths. I'm not saying he's like a terrible player or anything. I do think Mike Macdonald, as your defensive coach or as your head coach, is going to be an elevator of the offensive scheme and understands a lot of things. I think it's very fascinating that he went and got a guy who was a run game coordinator, tight end coach, probably not like the hottest name on the market. Why did he do that? Like, especially in relation to his quick decision to fire Ryan Grubb and go get Clinton Kubiak and how he wanted his offense to look after year one. My thought on it is it's both like they want to do the same stuff, but also that McDonald is trying to find ways to continue to iterate the same way that McVay's quote was that offenses need to continue to iterate. And then you hear that quote from Fleury that he says, you know, we want to try to add some things that Kyle Shanahan did. I think he like went into these interviews and was like, whoever can impress me with like, how do we iterate this offense to the next? Now, I don't know what that next phase is. The one thing is that Fleury's been talking about has been tempo a little bit, that they want to be a little more aggressive. I still have them as a pretty low play volume team, like a really low play volume team, even lower than you. But I'm concerned that I'm going to be wrong on that because it does seem to me like, and especially if they have to trail a little bit more this year, they were so comfortably ahead. Jack might have some better notes on that. I don't always have great data on that stuff, but I do know just from, you know, writing Stealing Signals last year and watching the games, it felt like every week I was writing, they're going to have to throw more when they get behind. And then they never trailed in any games like all year. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens here. I do think this offense may iterate more than, I think they're going to look similar to the Clint Kubiak team offense, but I think a lot of people are projecting it to be the same offense. They hired this no-name guy so they could install the same offense or whatever. No, I think they hired a guy that they think can do the similar stuff, but has bright ideas about how to iterate on that. You can't just do what you did last year, like the McVay quote said.
Yeah, and Sam Darnold was in San Francisco for a little bit when Fleury was there. I don't know if they had any like relationship really with Darnold in the quarterback room and Fleury as the tight ends coach at the time. But at least in the same building and maybe some of that familiarity too, kind of knowing a little bit more behind the scenes on Darnold and how to get the best out of him could factor in there. But yeah, Jack, any thoughts on the team level stuff here?
Yeah, we're basically projecting it as if, like Fleury said, as if they're going to try to emulate the Clint Kubiak offense as much as they can. I do think Kubiak's really sharp. The Saints offense in 2024 was unbelievable before injuries started to pile up. And then last year was obviously a Super Bowl winning season. So I think it's interesting how they're going to try to follow that up and if Fleury can keep the same level of efficiency. But I do think that Gretch's point on McDonald being one of the sharpest coaches in the league and his decision to even hire Fleury likely bodes well for Seattle's chances of succeeding again.
One thing I think will be interesting to monitor, you mentioned this on the AFC West pod that you asked Brandon Thorne about, you know, his thoughts on kind of like how much coaching affects the offensive line and scheme. And he said, you know, 55 to 60% comes with coaching. And now Kubiak is gone there. And I think that did help Sam Darnold out a lot last year. Darnold had a career low sack rate and that led to, or he had, you know, the lowest time to throw of his career as well as the lowest pressure to sack ratio. So I think probably a little bit on Darnold and a little bit on the offensive scheme there. I wonder how much that can transfer over. Darnold did have an 8.5 yards per attempt last season, but it only led to the quarterback 23 in fantasy points per game. Again, just not a whole lot of pass volume as Seattle, you know, did play in positive game script there a lot. In terms of Darnold inputs this year, we are nearly identical to Gretch. We're at 522 pass attempts, Gretch at 514, pretty much, you know, same yards per attempt there as well, same completion percentage. So almost identical across the board. On Darnold, we're essentially just in line with market where, you know, he's priced at the quarterback 23, which is again where he finished last year. That's where we have him ranked as well. So I don't think a whole lot of, you know, single QB appeal, but maybe some super flex and just like best ball stacking with Jackson Smith and Jigba up top for Darnold. So Gretch, sounds like you weren't as, I guess, inspired by Darnold's season last year. Before we were coming into last year, like Jalen Milroe was getting some. I remember like the detractions of JSN and his breakout season. Well, you don't know if in the fantasy playoffs, like Jalen Milroe might be starting. And then sure enough, Sam Darnold leads them to the Super Bowl. So I don't think there's necessarily any questions about his job security. But I don't know any concerns on Darnold heading into year 2 here for Seattle.
No major concerns. I do think that. I mean, so a lot of people are like, yeah, one of the stats that went around is he's the first quarterback, I think, in NFL history to win 14 games 2 years in a row, right? And it was like, okay, and he did it on 2 different teams. Like, oh, okay, so he's obviously good. I mean, my response, so last year I was one of the people I think on this show talking about, I think Milroe was going to make some starts. I think I projected Milroe for certainly some dropbacks in the offense. Darnold was much better last year than I anticipated, and I was wrong on that, and I like certainly own that. Still, from like where I'm at from an analyst perspective, I do still think he basically is a guy who was in two really great situations 2 years in a row. When we get to the NFC North, I'm going to be optimistic about Kyler Murray because I still think Kevin O'Connell's a good coach, even though the JJ McCarthy thing didn't go well. And then I think this past year, what they were able to implement in Seattle and how good the defense was and how they were able to run the ball to the degree they were, their pass rate was 51.3%, very, very low. Talk about passing into obvious and non-obvious spots. This is the guy last year that's probably the best example of somebody whose EPA per play was elevated by only passing on play action and non-obvious spots and then they would run on like third down and punt it knowing that their defense is just going to get the stop. They didn't make him drop back and throw on third down because like, we don't want to pick. Like the one time they asked him to go win a game for him early in the year against the Bucs, it was a tie game late. He threw a pick in their own field. They lost a game on a field goal. It was literally just get into field goal range. We win this game at home. He threw a pretty bad pick into double coverage. And like pretty much from that point on, they were like, we're going to win games by making the other team punt. And then, eventually we'll have you throw. He's not that bad, but he is not somebody that I see a massive fantasy ceiling to. I do see him as somebody who's probably going to regress statistically over time, especially if the Clint Kubiak effect hits somewhere. I think it'll hit right here with Sam Darnold. But they're going to stay, their defense is going to be great. I think Mike Macdonald's going to continue to build a good defense, even though they lost some personnel on that side. They still have a really high, win total. They're going to stay ahead of games, and he still has JSN. Like JSN's going to be wide open, and that's going to be helpful.
Yeah. Let's get into the backfield here. We have the Seahawks at 29th in pass rate, so certainly expecting a lot of running back carries here. And they also have Kenneth Walker, who departed in free agency to the Chiefs, and Zach Charbonnet, tore his ACL on January 17th. So that led to the Seahawks drafting Jadarian Price 32nd overall in the draft. They also bring in Emmanuel Wilson as a free agent. He signed a pretty, modest contract, 1 year, $1.6 million with only $550K guaranteed. And then you have George Halani, who was mostly a special teamer for the Seahawks in years past, but has kind of been getting some offseason buzz as maybe they'll look to get him some more touches this upcoming season. So this is a really, I think, tricky projection, just because you have to factor in what Charbonnet's role is going to be when he comes back. When exactly is he going to return from that ACL? It was a clean ACL tear at least, but he didn't have surgery till February 20th. So if you kind of factor that into the start of the season, he only has 6 months to fully recover from surgery date before the start of the season. Typically I think we would say probably like 9 months from the ACL surgery date, which would get him back, mid-October, even into November. So you're balancing that as well as them drafting Jadarian Price in the first round. And so I was very eager to see where we ended up on the touch distribution here. And like, wildly enough, we're almost like even across the board on Price, Wilson, and Halani, which I am just like pretty shocked by. For Price inputs, we have 183 carries and 28 targets. Gretch is at 167 carries and 26 targets. So a little bit lower on the rush attempts, but at least in the same vein there. Emmanuel Wilson, we're at 76 rush attempts. Gretch is at 75. And then George Halani, we're at 57. Gretch is at 58. Gretch is a little bit higher on Charbonnet at 117 carries. We're at 98. Again, that's kind of a tough one to pin down, just in terms of like, okay, when does he actually return? And then when he does return, what the role is going to be. So Jack, this has been a tough spot. We've been higher on the market on Jadarian Price kind of all offseason to this point. He's going at the end of the 5th round, which in this backfield that we expect to produce decently in fantasy, I think is a solid discount. But you have the end of season questions like when Charbonnet comes back, is Jadarian Price going to have meaningful role at all? So kind of take us through the projection distribution in this backfield.
Yeah, so I think Halani is going to get the pass down stuff early in the season, and then Charbonnet takes that over when he gets back. That's kind of what we saw last year when Charbonnet went down. Halani played 34% and 33% of snaps in the NFC Championship game and the Super Bowl. He only had 5 total carries in those 2 games. In total last year, he had 22 carries. 20 of those came in games where the Seahawks won by 20 plus. So I don't think that the Seahawks want him in a big role. I think that if Jadarian Price proves worthy of a big role in training camp, that he can, I don't think he'll have a whole lot of trouble pushing Halani to the side. I think maybe there's some chance that Halani gets some veteran deference in the first week or 2 of the year before Price establishes himself as the superior talent on early downs. With that being said, Price was not a huge pass catcher in college. That was Jeremiah Love. So I do think Halani is going to get the third downs, much like Charbonnet did when Kenneth Walker and Charbonnet were both healthy over the past couple of years. And then Emmanuel Wilson, it kind of sounds like might push for some short yardage roles, but it doesn't sound like he get much beyond that. He's been running with the third team so far this offseason. I think that once Charbonnet is back, he could really kind of fall down to zero. But Price is a really interesting rookie because most of the time with these rookies, we talk about them having progressively more value as the season goes on in the latter half of the season breakout. For Price, that almost might be inverted if Charbonnet comes back midseason and really forces a committee here. Like you said, our biggest difference is really just Price for Charbonnet. We have Wilson and Helani pretty similar to Gretch. And so if the Charbonnet timeline, the recent news has been pretty positive. If that starts to pick up more, maybe we come down on Price. And I know that they have been publicly optimistic on Helani's role as a rusher this offseason, but I'm not totally buying the Helani stuff. The area where I think we could be wrong on Price is if Charbonnet comes back earlier than we expect and if he has a bigger role than we expect. But at the same time, Price, I know his college production profile wasn't massive playing alongside Love, but he was a first round draft pick running back. That's pretty serious draft capital investment. And so for now, I feel okay about the Price projection.
Gretch, I know you haven't done a ton of drafting so far this summer, but I think this is like a really interesting just discussion in the backfield on how to approach them in fantasy drafts. So I'm curious your overall take on Jadarian Price as a prospect, since he did split work and was kind of like the secondary back to Jeremiah Love at Notre Dame. We don't have a ton of touches on film for him to dissect, and then you have the aspect that Zach Charbonnet, who's coming off a strong season last year, is likely going to be back towards the end of the year. Where do you see just kind of like the fantasy value and where you want to invest any capital, if at all, this offseason in this backfield?
Yeah, my concern with him would have been that I think being a workhorse is a skill, and we haven't gotten a chance to see that. That doesn't necessarily mean, he's behind Jeremiah Love, who we're going to talk about with Arizona, is just this uber prospect. And so it's not like people are like, I don't want to knock that, but at the same time, you can't give him credit for something that's not there. We don't know about whether he can maintain a big workload. And I do believe that being a workload is a skill, being able to handle a lot of the work. Another good example when we go to Arizona is Trey Benson. This is a guy who didn't get a lot of work throughout college, hasn't been able to stay healthy when he's gotten the opportunities to be a workhorse in the NFL level. And this is a second round pick that people are completely done with after 2 years. And I actually think Trey Benson is like a good player, but he can't stay healthy, right? He's not a workhorse. That doesn't mean Jadarian Price isn't going to stay healthy either. I'm not saying that. His limited usage has not necessarily been health related or anything. It's just we haven't seen it. He did a lot of kick returning in college and was good. They've mentioned that part of it. It's funny. I have a little more Charbonnet and a little less Price than you guys. I actually went back and changed that today because there was a quote just today as we're recording this about like Price isn't going to be the workhorse or something. And I was kind of tinkering with it a little bit more. Moved a little bit off Price. I was like, I'm probably high on Price. I bet we were even closer before I did that today. But as far as Price's actual profile, I was concerned about that going into the draft. Then you draft him in the first round into this backfield, and we have Charbonnet. Like Kenneth Walker's gone. The thing about Zach Charbonnet, he's good, but he is not a dynamic player. Like he's not an incredible running back by any means. He's a do everything, good, stable runner, and he's been very efficient in this offense and in this scheme. Jadarian Price could be very dynamic. That is the other part of this. He had really good rate stats, good evasion, really good breakaway rate all 3 years, good yards after contact. Again, the return stuff I think is interesting. He led the nation in kick return yardage average, which again speaks to some of the vision stuff. Very limited receiving, as you guys talked about, although they don't really throw to the backs in this offense anyway, and I don't know who would get the receiving. It's funny, you guys did a little bit more receiving for Helani, about 15 targets and 7.6 for Wilson. I have 16 for Wilson and 5 for Helani, and I just was going and looking at Helani's profile. He has 3 targets in his career, but it could easily be him. We don't know. Wilson did a little bit of it in Green Bay. He had 17 targets last year, 14 the year prior. He's a bigger back, but kind of does everything. I thought of him as the Charbonnet, 1-for-1 replacement. They're thinking of this guy can do a little bit of everything. He can play in the pass game. So we both have Wilson with a little bit more rushing. I have him with a little bit more receiving. I thought Wilson was pretty intriguing when they signed him, but I agree with Jack's point that now that you have Price in here and Charbonnet coming back, he could wind up completely phased out. At the same time, if they're not going to make Price at every down back early, I kind of think the Helani stuff is just a little bit of veteran deference, like he was saying, and the incumbent thing. 25 career carries, 3 career targets for this guy. He's 26 years old. He was really exciting at times last year, but he's not like he's been a special teams guy mostly for his career over the last couple of years. He's not like a big running back. Wilson is a guy who had over 100 carries both the last 2 years in that Green Bay offense, and basically had to do like his best facsimile of Josh Jacobs at times, and would get like all the work that Josh Jacobs got a couple of times for like individual games. And so I don't know. It's a really tricky one. There's a lot of different profiles here. The Charbonnet timeline, as you guys talked about, I've been pretty concerned about too. I'm not, as far as how I'm playing it, I'm not wanting to take much Charbonnet. I'm wanting to bet against a guy coming back that quickly. And I don't think he's an exceptional talent. It's probably a tough thing in year one coming back when you're not even like an elite, like you're not Adrian Peterson coming back off an ACL or Breece Hall or one of these guys. I liked Wilson, but I also liked the price thing. So I initially was like, you can't give this guy credit for things he hasn't done. At the same time, once he lands on this offense, and especially if Wilson's not a real threat, he seems like the most talented player, and they really liked him. They brought him in. I do think like some of the skills are probably there with, again, I talked about the kick return and all this, like the yards after contact, the evasion, the breakaway rate. He probably has really good vision. Like, I mean, if he's just a really good runner, one of the things I talked about with him right after the draft is that he doesn't bounce runs outside, that was the knock on Ken Walker. I think that's why they liked Charbonnet. I mean, Jadarian Price is probably just better than Zach Charbonnet. Like, if we really get down to it, it's not crazy. If he's the stuff that they liked about Charbonnet, that he's not bouncing like Ken Walker, but he's better than Charbonnet, like it's going to be a valuable role even after Charbonnet comes back. He's going to be a big part of a good team. So anyway, I came around to him pretty quickly after they took him in the first round onto this offense. They obviously really like him. It seems like the price could be good.
It's kind of a tougher pick, I think, in these best ball tournament formats where like all the money is in weeks, 15 to 17 and 17, especially just kind of knowing what Price's role will be. But again, we have been above market on him all summer. I've been taking a little bit of him. I think, if kind of prices hold into the redraft season, we are still, we are even above his FFPC redraft rank, which is pretty wild for a running back on FFPC. For us, we're typically trailing behind all the running backs on FFPC, but like he's someone I think, like I'll probably end up on some decent redraft teams if the price holds, just because, certainly they're saying, they aren't expecting him to be a workload or a workhorse right away. But the fact that they used a first round pick on him, I think is, more like a stronger indication to me that he'll probably end up in that role, even if that's not quote unquote what they envision right away.
And part of the bet with the rookies as they progress into more work, even though this does look like it could be the flipped version of that, but part of the bet is we don't know what they are yet. They don't necessarily know what they have yet. They get some opportunity and they perform and they earn more, and it becomes a little bit undeniable that they need to be on the field. He's going to have that runway when Charbonnet's off. If he's good, if he's actually as talented as they think he is, and he's very productive, they're not going to rush, like they're going to slow Charbonnet's timeline. Like they're not going to rush Charbonnet back to get him off the field. That's sort of you have to think about when you make the pick, you're betting not on Charbonnet not coming back or anything. You're betting on Jadarian Price breaking out as a rookie, right? Like having the runway early, breaking out, and then being undeniable. He's their starting running back because he's having a great year. He's already at, 800 yards when Charbonnet comes back. They're not going to bench him.
Yeah, and Gretch mentioned his name when he was talking about Emmanuel Wilson, and he mentioned Trey Benson as someone who didn't have the workhorse profile in college and couldn't really sustain it in the pros. But Josh Jacobs never had more than 120 carries in a single college season. He went in the first round despite that, and then as a rookie, he had 242 carries. So there is some precedent for NFL teams kind of actually watching these guys and seeing the skills that they have and looking past the college workload and then immediately trusting them with a bigger workload than they actually had in college.
All right, let's go to the wide receiver room here, headlined by Jackson Smith and Jigba. JSN led the team with 177 targets last year. That includes the playoffs, but the rest of Seattle wide receivers had 153. So just a very JSN-centric offense last year. Pretty outrageous, yards per outrun, target per outrun numbers. And despite his average depth of targets going up from 2.5 yards from the year prior, he still maintained a 73% catch rate on the season. So after talking about Lab McConkey earlier today, I obviously think JSN is a better player than Lab McConkey, but I have some shades of just like, man, JSN, while he's an unreal player, absolutely sun ran a little bit on some of the deeper targets last year to perform that efficiently. And we mentioned, kind of Seattle playing from ahead a little bit, but again, not to detract from JSN at all. Absolute beast at wide receiver. But the Seahawks in that wide receiver room this year have Rashid Shaheed, who they signed to a 3-year, $51 million contract this offseason, $35 million guaranteed there. They bring back Cooper Kupp, who's in the second year of a 3-year, $45 million deal with Seattle. And then Torrey Horton remains in this wide receiver room as well. He is still recovering from an offseason shin surgery that caused him to miss time towards the end of last year. And he did not participate in any of the spring practices, which I was a little bit concerned about. The commentary around him was that he might not even be ready for day one of training camp. So I think that probably puts Torrey Horton clearly as, the wide receiver 4 here. So let's talk through JSN, Shaheed, and Cooper Kupp. Up top on JSN, we have 144 targets. Gretch is at 158 there. On Rashid Shaheed, we're at 61. Actually, on both Shaheed and Kupp, we're at 61 targets. Gretch is at 71 on Shaheed and 60 on Kupp. So a little bit further ahead on Shaheed there. That's certainly something we've been way ahead market on Cooper Kupp in the best ball market, and have kind of taken away some targets and given to Shaheed as well. Again, we have them even, but Gretch has them ahead. So I guess, kind of burying the lead here with JSN, but I do want to get to the wide receiver 2 battle here between Shaheed and Kupp. Gretch, curious what you see there between those two. And again, Shaheed signed this big 3-year deal this offseason. Do you think that Seattle is going to feature him more? He only ran more routes than Kupp in one game since he was acquired last season. Kupp remained in that wide receiver 2 role. So curious your thoughts there on that gap between them two this year.
Yeah, Shaheed basically did nothing. Played in 12 games with Seattle, fewer than 30 receiving yards 10 times, fewer than 10 receiving yards 8 of those 12 games. I mean, just absolutely no role. I do think the deep efficiency that he's shown and the ball and hand skills that he's shown are worth chasing a little bit. And then just this old Mike Tomlin quote that I always go back to, it's hard to board a moving train. I mean, it's like they're a successful offense when he comes in. Now you get the whole offseason, you get the new contract, as you talked about. I think it's going to be a little bit of a different situation there. Kupp's 15.8% targets per out last year, career low by a ton, even below his early career seasons, despite JSN being out there. And I mean, JSN's taking a lot of the targets. You can say that for sure. There was a Mina Kimes stat that I loved in the postseason that I may not get the stat exactly right, but I believe it was on deep targets when JSN was on the field. Seattle receivers averaged double the separation of the league average, right? So that's this gravity stat, right? That you get single coverages downfield. Torrey Horton had the 5 touchdowns on just 13 receptions. I think it was helpful for Shaheed. It's helpful for a lot of different guys. I think it's, a notable thing for Cooper Kupp that if he's out there not able to draw a lot of targets when JSN's drawing all this attention, that's a little bit tricky. I do think he's still going to be out there, though. They really like him. I think if he runs another 400 routes, I basically have that as good for JSN's consolidation. The JSN element, and basically I think Kupp is too far into the decline phase of his career to be super interesting. Shaheed maybe is interesting, but the JSN thing is really so with Puka, it was like he's done this really high targets per route thing over the last couple of years, and it's a profile that I can see as more sustainable. JSN's efficiency looks unsustainable. You just talked about it with the deep efficiency and everything. His yards per out run looks unsustainable. His efficiency, I will note, it carried the offense to quicker drives and fewer plays. This is one of those ones where the long touchdowns are hurting his own routes total. So I think there's a lot of people that are like, he can't be in the same tier as Puka or Chase because they don't throw as much. Well, they didn't throw as much last year in part because JSN had that yards per out run that he had. Every time he was out there, he was scoring super quick. So if you're regressing all of his efficiency out, you do have to expect for a little bit more plays and things. But the really crazy stat on him, which is even a lot higher than Puka Nacua, JSN had 44.1% of the team's receiving yardage. Nacua was like 39%, which is still crazy, right? But like 40+%, when we used to look at dominator rating back in the day as like the main college stat, like small school guys would still, like, if they went over 40% in a year, it was like, holy crap, that's amazing. In the FBS, JSN did this in the NFL season. I wasn't going to like do a huge study on it. So I just asked Google AI. It said Josh Gordon's season was the most all time. I bet that doesn't include like when the forward pass was just starting. Cause like those guys were like, they had one receiver that caught 90% of their passes. I'm pretty sure. But JSN's 44.1% was just behind Josh Gordon's 44.2%. And there was only like 3 other seasons that were over 40%. Like Calvin Johnson's 1,900-yard season was on there and a couple others. Like I said, Puka was down at like 39%, even though he had more receiving yards. JSN was this whole passing offense last year. We did see in the postseason, 2 of his games were a lot lower in production. I think it was like 20 yards and 30 yards, sandwiched with a monster game against the Rams in the NFC Championship. So it's not like every team could just shut him down. But and teams are trying to stop him during the regular season as well, obviously, right? And he had like 90-plus receiving yards, I think, in like 13 of his first 15 games or something absurd. I mean, every single week, they found a way to get him very involved and very productive, even though it was a very low volume passing game. So, I mean, I just think that speaks to JSN being as good as he is. He was able to create separation. I was a little unfair to Darnold earlier. I know Seattle fans listening are like, I mean, you're talking about a game in week 5 when he threw a pick and he went on to win a Super Bowl. But I do think Darnold's a good enough quarterback to continue to sustain JSN. JSN, I think, was very helpful for Darnold in creating a lot of separation, a lot of the like deep over routes and things that they ran. But Darnold delivers those balls well. I mean, you give him a clean pocket, he makes all those throws that you need him to make. So, I mean, I'm still very into JSN. I have a hard time projecting him because this type of efficiency, 44% of the team's receiving yards, this type of yards per out run, I want to regress it all. But I also I think he's very good. He's going into his prime, and the specific way this offense is set up as a very run-heavy offense that throws off of that, I do think is very likely to still feature JSN. I think he has one of the highest floors out there. This guy's very, very good and going to get a lot of volume and production. I just don't know if the ceiling can match Puka and Jamar Chase. So I do think he should be going behind them, but you have to feel really good about him if you get him in the middle of the first round.
In terms of the efficiency potentially coming down, JSN was at 11.0 yards per target last year, just outrageous on 163 targets there. But we kind of landed in a similar spot here. We're at 9.6 yards per target. Gretch is at 9.5 there. And I mean, there are just so many JSN stats that are insane from last year. You could, continue to rattle them off. I do want to add one more. He had the same amount of games with a 50+% target share. That's 50% as he did with a sub 22% target share for the Seahawks last year. So just like the weekly floor or I guess weekly share floor of targets that JSN had was just out of control as well with the ceiling. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I ever remember seeing like a single wide receiver getting over 50% of their team's targets in a game, let alone twice in a season. It's just absolutely outrageous.
Not to take away from Puka Nacua, who I do think is the better fantasy player, but people were really mad about the offensive player of the year thing because Nacua had better raw numbers. And like, these are the numbers. JSN was the whole offense. He should have been in the MVP discussion. Like literally, I'm not saying Sam Darnold was nothing, but like Sam Darnold's throwing to him over 50% of the time that often, like 44, like throw to someone else, do something, like show me something.
Oh man. Well, Jack, we are, after talking through this, I think we might want to shift some work off Kupp to Shaheed. That again, that's been a spot we've kind of been targeted at all offseason is, man, why are we so high on Cooper Kupp? And in the back end of drafts, it's not like we're very high. We're at 60 targets on the season. I do think Kupp is a valuable piece to this offense, even though he may not be an elite target earner there for the Seahawks. But I don't know, any wrap up wide receiver thoughts here before we head to the tight end room, Jack?
Yeah, I'll just add that once Shaheed got acquired, obviously Shaheed's routes were down, but Kupp was also ahead of him in targets per route run. Kupp averaged 0.18 targets per route run. Shaheed was at 0.15. Kupp is probably one of those guys where it just doesn't feel good, but he's a fine best ball pick because we know he's going to play. We know he's going to be on the field. And we know he's going to have a not completely insignificant target share. And so if you can get that safe floor and someone who's not going to be a zero, that is pretty valuable in best ball. And right now we're literally 39 picks ahead of his underdog ADP. So we
What's his underdog ADP?
It is 200 and
205. Yeah.
205.1. Yeah. So you can get him in basically the last round. We know he's going to play. So we have room to shift more to Shaheed and still pretty much have Kupp as someone you should be drafting as much as you can.
I'm super out on Kupp, but I love that take for best ball for sure. I mean, at that
right
point,
in redraft, the upside is probably just not there at this stage of his career, and you want someone who has legitimate upside, but you'd be fine dropping if he doesn't pan out. Kupp is probably just going to be 7-8 points per game, which has zero value in redraft, but some value in best ball.
Totally,
for sure. Let's go to the tight end room then. AJ Barner and Elijah Arroyo headline the room here. Arroyo was a second round pick last year, got injured midseason, and then, didn't really get much opportunity down the stretch as AJ Barner had kind of seized control of that tight end one spot. Barner, a little bit more of a traditional inline tight end, though. 83% of his snaps came inline last year, whereas Elijah Arroyo was 58% inline and then 40% in the slot or out wide. But Barner was, probably a better like real life football player than fantasy asset here. In terms of projections, we're at 56 targets on AJ Barner. Gretch is at 65. We're at 35 targets on Elijah Arroyo. Gretch is at 37. So pretty much in lockstep here. Again, not a whole lot of fantasy appeal there. AJ Barner is going at like 175 overall on Underdog. We're at 204 in the ranking, so about 30 spots behind there. I don't know if there's really much target upside here for Barner, but he's again, he is one of those guys that like the coaches love, probably will be on the field a lot. But yeah, take it away, Gretch.
I love that position you guys have. I had a high receiving TD rate last year and did some tush push stuff, so I think people are probably excited about some touchdown potential there. But he had an offseason cleanup thing as well and has missed some of the offseason. Arroyo's a year 2 guy who could cut into the split a little more. He only ran 361 routes. Barner, 1.44 yards per out run on that number like of routes is not really a fantasy viable tight end role. I think people also remember that he famously scored the first touchdown in the Super Bowl after we waited like 3 quarters to figure out who was going to be the first TD scorer, and he was a popular prop bet. He had 2 catches in the first 2 playoff games combined. I mean, that's what AJ Barner's role is. I think people are like, Super Bowl hero, but like he didn't do anything in the other games. I do think, and then you have a new offensive coordinator as well, who's a tight ends coach at the old place and may have a different read on how they want to utilize the different weapons. But you're really just betting on the touchdown rate. I mean, I think Barner's interesting, but I think Arroyo's maybe interesting as he goes into year 2 as well. It's probably just too split. There's not enough pass volume. If you want to go to the secondary pieces, I mean, I like Jack's point about Kupp and best ball or Shaheed. I mean, like, or else just play JSN. Like, this is going to be a very concentrated pass game.
The Seahawks also have this dude Robbie Outs or something, who is kind of like a hybrid fullback. So he's a part of some heavier personnel. He also missed some time last year. I imagine that coming over from San Francisco again, Kyle Juszczyk is used a lot there. They use a lot of 21 personnel. I could see that tendency tilting over to the Seahawks again this offseason to there with Robbie Oos as an honorable mention here as we close up the Seahawks. All right, let's go to everyone's favorite team to discuss in the division. That's the Arizona Cardinals. Last and certainly least, in my opinion, the Cardinals kind of broke me last year. Honestly, that Jacoby Brissett stretch down the tail end of the season was a little bit too much for me to comprehend projection wise. But I digress. Let's get into the 2026 projections here. They bring in Mike LaFleur as the head coach here, and he will be the play caller for the Arizona Cardinals. On a team level, we have for Arizona 60.4 plays at ETR. Gretch is at 60.1. We're at a 63.2% pass rate. Gretch is at 63%. So near lockstep there on a team level, which is, I think probably a good thing with a new coach coming into town. Just a reminder, the Cardinals led the league in pass rate last year at 69.6%. So nearly a 70% pass rate there for the Cardinals. That was 4% in raw pass rate clear of any other team in the league. So certainly expecting a lot of aggression there. Our 63.2% pass rate for this season, though, is the 3rd highest projection that we have across the league. They led the NFL in raw pass attempts last year with 649. They had 277 more pass attempts than the Ravens last year. That's 16 more per game. I just thought that was pretty wild discrepancy there. And then you also have the quarterback conundrum here, where Jacoby Brissett again was the starter down the stretch last year, but is kind of holding out this spring and summer for starters money. He is a 33-year-old journeyman backup at this point. They drafted Carson Beck at the top of the 3rd round, and also have Gardner Minshew in the quarterback room, who I feel like is pretty on par with Brissett here. So I was curious to see where Gretch landed on kind of the split in this quarterback room. Right now we have Jacoby Brissett with 60% of the starts and the other 40% on Carson Beck. We don't have any on Minshew right now, but in terms of raw pass attempts, Gretch is even lower than us on Jacoby Brissett at 283. We're at 342. So, curious your thoughts just on this QB room, Gretch, and how you kind of have it projected. How many starts are you expecting for Carson Beck? Do you think Minshew will get in there at all? Does this holdout from Brissett lead to anything? I mean, it's a not super fun quarterback trio to discuss, but certainly one that I think is meaningful to projecting this upcoming season.
So I had it at 60-40 the way you guys do with Brissett, and then I went to 50-50. Yeah, it's definitely different than like the Mendoza one that we talked about on the other show, where it was like, yeah, they're going to get this number 1 overall pick in as soon as possible. This is a 3rd round quarterback prospect that there's concerns about decision-making, accuracy. Polarizing comes up a lot in the prospect stuff, which with him seems to mean some people hate him, because I can't really find anything on him that's like really optimistic. So the polarizing is like either he's a 3rd round talent or he's undraftable. Like that seems to be the difference of opinion on him. I don't. And then they have the hardest schedule in the NFL by look at lines we were talking about. Like Warren Sharp does that thing, and it's like way harder than everyone else. They're going to play from behind a lot. The back thing, like I guess I don't know how much he's going to play. I know people are really concerned about some of the passing weapons because they'll have a rookie QB in there, so it's important to dial this in. I will say that even if Brissett plays a lot, I don't think we can expect the same pass environment under new coaches. It was too much of an outlier, even controlling for the quarterback. And really last year for the Cardinals is a really good reminder that, like, when we talk about team play volume and a lot of these things as we go through the projections, a lot of it is really tricky. They added over 100 pass attempts year over year to the year prior. They were going into the year with Kyler Murray. He only plays 5 games, and then they bring in Brissett, and it changes like all of it, right? And it makes them way more pass heavy than we expected. They throw more passes than any team in the league. I'm going to jump ahead to the tight end, so I apologize, but I think this is helpful. Trey McBride ran 695 routes last year. It was more than 100 clear of all other tight ends. This is on PFF's data. From their data all the way back through 2006, the closest season by any tight end was Jason Witten in 2012 at 628, which is still 67 routes shy of McBride. That's obviously back when there were 16-game seasons, but you're talking about, like, that's the next highest of any tight end in 20 years. So, like, even a high volume tight end season is like 100 routes clear, or maybe even a little more. I mean, Bowers was the guy who ran the most tight end routes in 2024. He was at 592. And the whole thing going into last year for Bowers was like, oh, he ran all these routes. Is that going to regress? McBride was more than 100 clear of that. I mean, he had like multiple games worth of additional routes over what we would consider, like 3 games worth over what we consider other high volume tight end route seasons. I'm a huge McBride fan, but you do have to understand that. And that goes back to Michael Wilson. And it's going to go back to everything that we talk about on this team. This pass environment was insane in terms of how much they actually threw the ball. And so, yeah, what are they going to be this year? Like they're going to have a rookie quarterback for some of it, right? And then they have a different coach. And I don't really know what to expect with LaFleur. A lot of McVay assistants have gone on to build like 11 personnel offenses, which is what McVay was always doing. McVay's been doing different stuff in these last couple of years with LaFleur there. I guess my guess is that we're probably going to get some mirroring here too, and he'll do things a little bit like LA was last year. So I'm projecting, a similar kind of lean in that regard. A bad team's gonna lean toward the pass heavy side. Obviously, their play volume is going to be low because they're not going to be good enough to sustain drives, and that's one of those things that we see. So, I mean, it's not just that they were an outlier last year on the pass attempts one direction. It's also that now you look at it this year, they're probably going to be. I mean, they have the lowest projected points per game by look-ahead lines. So you're talking about an offense that's not going to hold the ball, that's not going to score a lot of points. The whole thing goes all the way to the other side very drastically, which is a concern for Trey McBride. Yeah. It's a concern for all of the key pieces.
I think it's a really interesting spot in the market because it's just so easy to get, the recency bias of, oh, this happened last season. It's, that's a likely thing to happen again. Last year was just such an anomaly in the pass attempts. And we are belaboring the point a little bit, but I think it's worth it just because of all the compounding factors that led to it. The Cardinals were also 8th in third down conversion rate last year, which I thought was interesting. They were able to sustain a lot of drives, which, they finished 6th in real plays per game, did the Cardinals. So, I think with weaker quarterback play, again, the tougher schedule, their average spread this year is Cardinals plus 8.6. So, looking to be big underdogs in every game. And again, I don't think that will continue to lead to like high play volume and high pass volume. We also had this backfield just get decimated last year. I mean, they're running out Michael Carter and Bam Knight and then Amari DiMercado, so it's kind of like that led them to throw a ton with Brissett and Michael Wilson and Trey McBride. They're up top. So it is hard to disassociate from what happened last year, but I think this year just the outlook and a new coaching staff helps us disassociate. But man, I think it's just going to be a drastically different offense than we saw down the stretch last season. All right, let's go to the backfield here. I don't think any of the quarterbacks are necessarily fantasy viable. Jacoby Brissett is getting drafted in best ball stuff, but I don't know. I think he's pretty much untouchable at this point, just given the tough strength of schedule to begin the season and then the competition behind him there. So I do want to start in a running back room here where they drafted Jeremiah Love, 3rd overall, elite running back profile here for Love, akin to the likes of Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson, the current league's best backs out there. It's an interesting setup though, because they did sign Tyler Algier to a 2-year, $12.25 million contract. He got $8 million guaranteed in the offseason. They also re-signed James Conner to a 1-year, $3 million deal, and they have Trey Benson still on the roster, who Gretch alluded to earlier. So it's, I don't know, an on setup. I really don't understand kind of like the decision making this offseason from the Cardinals brass here. But in terms of inputs, we're pretty close on Jeremiah Love. We're at 216 rush attempts. Gretch is at 219. We're at 59.5 targets. Gretch at 59 there. So nearly identical, projections and output. We're at 189 half PPR fantasy points. Gretch at 195. So a little bit higher on the receiving touchdowns is kind of creates the separation there. We are quite a bit higher on Tyler Algier at 108 carries. Gretch is at 52. And then Gretch is a little bit higher on James Conner than we are. He's at 52 carries. We're at 29 there. So again, a lot of potential mouths to feed here. Jack, we're recording this on June 29th. I wouldn't be shocked this offseason if one of these backs gets moved to another team. It seems like that's probably the most likely outcome. But, given Jeremiah Love was drafted 3rd overall and, take us into your thoughts on his touch projection and outlook for this upcoming season, as well as this backfield.
Yeah, I think when you invest that kind of capital into a running back, he's basically going to be the clear workhorse. I know that they just signed Tyler Algier, but Love is just a superior talent than him. It's really unlucky for Algier that he goes from Bijan Robinson, gets this new deal in Arizona, and all of a sudden they draft a running back 3rd overall and he's the RB2 again. Love's a good pass catcher. He caught 55 balls over his last 2 years at Notre Dame. I think that he's going to be the clear pass down back here. The only question I'd really have is just the extent to which he controls the carries. I think that when you invest that kind of capital in running back, that he's going to be the bulk early down guy, but is it going to be a 2-to-1 split? Is it going to be a 60-40 split? We don't really know. Interestingly, like you said, we do come in pretty similar on Love carries to Gretch. The other thing that I guess you could raise as a concern would be what Algier's involvement looks like in the red zone or on short yardage. He matched Bijan with 7 carries inside the 5-yard line last year. Does he have any type of goal line role, or does that all go to Love? But generally, I think Love, when you draft a guy 3rd overall, he's going to be the clear workhorse. It's just the exact percentages that are a little trickier to nail down.
We are getting a little bit of a discount from where Ashton Jeanty went in last year's draft. He was more at the 1-2 turn. Jeremiah Love this year going more at the 2-3 turn. I do think Jeanty's lackluster rookie performance probably impacting that a little bit. But curious, Gretch, your thoughts on Jeremiah Love here. Kind of a tough landing spot and maybe a little bit more competition in the backfield than we typically see with other, highly drafted rookie backs. Do you think that is going to be much of a factor at all, or to kind of take us through your thoughts on this backfield split?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a factor. I agree with Jack that with this type of draft capital, the guy's going to be the clear workhorse, but it's a question of, Jeanty got all of the work. Are you getting like all of the work or not? Because you're in the worst projected scoring offense in the NFL. And so you kind of need to get all of the work. The offensive line shouldn't be terrible, or at least they've tried to address it. They've signed some new guys. They drafted a 2nd-round guard, probably still expected to be a little bit slightly below average, but there's some optimism in some of the stuff I was looking up. The Algier thing has been tricky for me. Maybe you guys can help me. The 2-year, $12 million deal, I mean, it's a decent deal, but like as far as free agent deals go, like guys get paid. He has played on special teams all the way through all of last year. Like he's always been a special teams guy. He's a former converted linebacker famously in college. When they brought him in and they still had Conner and Benson, I wasn't even really sure why he was getting he's going to be the RB1 vibe early in the offseason. Because to me, I was like, yeah, they're bringing in a guy that will add running back depth and a guy that can play on special teams and things. But if you look at, I guess, peripherals, he had a 3.6 yards per carry last year. His peripherals were not great. They've been up and down. They've been better some years. He had a really good rush TD rate last year. And Jack's going to chime in and remind me that when a guy gets 5.6% rushing TD rates, is he can't run for 20-yard gains when he's scoring touchdowns every time. And that's very valid. But and he was very efficient as a short yardage runner. And so there's things that I do see in the profile, but he's not necessarily a great receiving back, or he had a limited receiving role. He's never caught 20 passes in a season. And like, they also went and signed James Conner, and James Conner's been the guy that's been their do everything back for years, and also had a huge red zone role and been a really good goal line scorer. He's got that like captain energy, like, oh, you go give him those touches. I mean, as far as Love's concerned, like it is a problem that there are multiple of these guys behind him. I don't know what it's going to mean, but they paid both those guys this offseason. And then Benson, to me, is probably the most talented of the three backups. He's had really big yards per carries his first 2 years. He's actually been good. I know everyone's like, I'm sick of that dude. We drafted him. He wasn't good for fantasy. But like his evasion has been, as advertised, it was really good in his prospect profile. He was at 0.33 missed tackles forced per touch last year, which is elite stuff. And like before James Conner got hurt, he was playing a lot more than he had been as a rookie. This is now under a whole different regime and everything. He was starting to play more. He was starting to cut into Conner. He was starting to play more on pass downs. It was like, ooh, this is interesting. Then Conner got hurt, and it was like, oh, Trey Benson wheels up, and then he gets hurt like the next week. And now we're like the second round pick going into year 3, who actually had really good evasion, good breakaway rates, good 5.5 yards per carry last year. Like looked like he was like a legit breakout candidate before that injury. Yeah, I mean, the best of ability is availability and all those things, but he actually looks interesting to me. So, like, before the Love pick, I was like, I kind of want to play Trey Benson to end up beating out Algier and Conner a little bit. Now it's like, man, you have 3 back. Benson's probably going to get cut or traded or something, but I'm going to be in on him wherever he lands probably. Like, I actually think there's an intrigue in the profile.
Yeah, I agree with you on Benson. I think that he is the most interesting from a talent standpoint. I do think that given the timing of them signing Algier with this new staff, I mean, Benson has no connection to the new staff. The new staff signed Algier basically as soon as they got hired. So I think that you can clearly say that the staff values Algier over Benson. That doesn't mean Benson can't be good elsewhere. It just means for this specific situation. And then on Algier versus Conner didn't sign an extension. He restructured his deal.
Okay.
I think it was very, very likely that he was going to get cut if he didn't restructure his deal. I think that he basically agreed to the restructure and to a pay cut so that he could remain with Arizona. He's 31 years old. I don't know, what his priorities are, or if he didn't think he'd have a market in free agency. But I feel pretty good about Algier as the RB2 here. That doesn't mean I think he's like some awesome fantasy pick. He's going to be an early down guy at best with Love healthy. If Love goes down, he doesn't have a pass catching profile, and he's on the worst offense in football from an implied team total standpoint. So it's fair to question what the actual workload is worth, even if Love goes down. But I do think that he's pretty clearly the RB2 here.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. It seems like with the Conner restructuring that Benson can't be active on game day. Like, because Algier's going to play on special teams probably at least a little bit, even if he is still sort of, the RB2. Like, that's been a skill set of his. Like I said, he's been doing it even behind Bijan in Atlanta as the clear RB2 there for years. So, like,
yeah, it's just kind of an odd series of events this offseason.
Yeah.
And Geo contract isn't a ton, but he did get $8 million guaranteed, which is the same that J.K. Dobbins got guaranteed with the Broncos. And Dobbins was like their prize or their key target in this offseason. So it was, I think, like decent, meaningful money again. Not something that we saw like Travis Etienne get with the Saints or anything. But $8 million guaranteed is nothing to sneeze at, I think, in this current running back market.
Oh, sure. I wasn't trying to I wasn't trying to downplay it too much. He sounded like the first day of free agency,
yeah.
And so sometimes you get a little more money on those very first contracts, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're. Well, anyway, I like Jack's note, and I don't have a clear read on this. So, I mean, I'm glad that he's got a clear read on it, that Algier's going to be sort of the number 2. Regardless, the bigger thing that we all think is that Love is going to be pretty clearly the lead back. My issue and our projections sort of reflected is like, where's the ceiling within this offense? He's going to have to be really dynamic on his own. and like elevate the offense above what the market is seeing for the offense. And the market is factoring in that they have Jeremiah Love and they don't think they're going to score a lot of points. So it's, I mean, even from that perspective, like you were saying, you don't really think Algiers a great pick. I'm going to probably adjust my projections to give Algier more as the number 2. I don't think I want to play him as the back, like the handcuff in this offense necessarily.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a stay away. And maybe if one of these guys gets moved or cut or, you know, whatever happens the rest of this offseason, that'll maybe provide some further clarity. But at this point in time, I think it's hard to really see much fantasy upside beyond Love, even with Love, you know, as you said,
taking a few,
like
you kind of have to consider taking a few stabs at Love because he is cheap enough, and you're like, I mean, he's a super prospect.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the wide receiver room here. Another kind of tricky one to talk through as Marvin Harrison Jr. and Michael Wilson headline the room. They also brought in 31-year-old Kendrick Bourne, who's been the Kyle Shanahan system a lot of his career, also spent a few years in New England as well. But you know, the big story, along with Trey McBride's just absolutely, monstrous close to the season was Michael Wilson's as well. And he kind of benefited from just that pure route volume. Also, he was second in the NFL among wide receivers in total routes run last year, behind only Jamar Chase. And the splits there for Michael Wilson are pretty dramatic when Marvin Harrison is on and off the field. For Michael Wilson, with Marvin Harrison Jr. on the field last year, Michael Wilson had a 13% target per out run that jumped all the way to 29% with Marvin Harrison Jr. off the field. If we go back to when Marvin Harrison was drafted in 2024, so the last 2 seasons, it's just a 14% target per out run for Michael Wilson there. So it really was just a massive breakout with Harrison off the field. But this Wilson profile is interesting. You know, he just turned 26. He's a legit, you know, pretty big wide receiver, 6'2", 213 pounds. He has 8.3 yards per target across his career. So, you know, relatively decent there, but I do think Marvin Harrison, you know, still should be viewed as wide receiver 1 here. In terms of inputs for the Cardinals, we have Marvin Harrison at 105 targets. Gretch is at 109. We are at 95 targets on Michael Wilson. Gretch is at 109 there. So he kind of split the two evenly. Jack, do you kind of agree with me on the Harrison Jr. and Wilson split? And then we can get Gretch's thoughts since he has them even currently in targets.
Yeah, it's a new staff, so I'm not even sure how much we want to weigh this. But even after Michael Wilson had 2 massive games without Marvin Harrison last year, when MHJ came back, they each had 7 targets in the first game Harrison came back in. But Marvin Harrison left early again, and before he left early, it was 7-3 Harrison, and then Wilson had 4 targets in the fourth quarter after he left. So every time Harrison was available, they kept going back to him as their wide receiver 1. Again, it's a new staff, so I don't totally know how much to weigh that. I don't mind where Gretch has it with them both just even, with Harrison having the higher pedigree and Wilson showing more last year. I think it'll be interesting. I think the wide receiver snaps will be really condensed around these two. I think that this is a team that's going to play their backup tight ends quite a bit, so I'm not super worried about the wide receiver 3 and such eating into them. I mean, this is a good time to bring up one of my favorite quotes of the offseason when Mike LaFleur said that Marvin Harrison Jr. will play the Devontae Adams role and Michael Wilson will play the Puka role, which is, just if you need a baseline expectation for these guys. But yeah, I think we're leaning into, with the new staff, the fact that Harrison had better target earning last year when they were both on the field, and the fact that he was still the 4th overall pick and they still have some level of commitment to him because of that. But Wilson, in those games Harrison missed last year, certainly showed more than MHJ ever has. And it's a really tough one to figure out.
It's like the way that you're talking about it is exactly the way that I'm thinking of it, which is like, this is a classic like example of how much do you weigh different splits. I mean, yeah. I think part of the Michael Wilson thing was a real connection with Jacoby Brissett. I feel like there's like real stuff there sometimes with the QB things. Michael Wilson had 18 total targets in 5 Kyler games. He later had an 18 target game with Jacoby Brissett. He had 2 more at 15 targets. He, like you said, he ran 1 route shy. If you look at his full numbers, 19.7% targets per route was a big bump from his previous career high, but clearly impacted by Marvin Harrison missing time. I put in my notes, which Jack just, obviously laid out very well. And then I have in my other notes that Marvin Harrison Jr. has a very similar yards per out run to Wilson, just way fewer routes. And he ran all his against Wilson, whereas Wilson had a bunch of his routes with no Harrison on the field, which is helpful. And yet it is tricky to not like, how much do you want to look at splits? How much do you want to consider the fact that the quarterback that's likely to start week 1, Jacoby Brissett, targeted Wilson 15 plus times in 3 separate games last year. Like a lot of their late game stuff was just like quick outs and things like that. I mean, I do think there's an element there. The reason I split them at 50-50 gets back to, well, one, what Jack said about Harrison being better when they're on the field together. But I don't think we just throw out what Wilson did, obviously, when Harrison was off the field, because, I mean, it was so insane. But 2, the point that Jack made about Harrison's pedigree, which I do think still very much matters and should matter. I always talk about the long view stuff. He's a guy who was very productive in college, like very, very productive. And I don't think through 2 years that we should like think of him as a bust or anything like that. I mean, this was a guy that did a lot at Ohio State. The one thing that they have going for him is it does seem like it's going to be very concentrated. They brought in Kendrick Bourne. LaFleur is excited about that. Looks like the clear number 3. They drafted this Reggie Virgil guy. Doesn't seem super exciting as a rookie 5th rounder. We both have Bourne for about 50-ish targets. This is the closest projection we've had across this team this whole series, but we have it very concentrated on the top 2 receivers, then Bourne for about 50 as this wide receiver 3 that's not even that much of a threat. And then we both have Virgil right around just under 20, and then Duvernay is the 5th guy at like 6 targets, like not a lot for wide receiver 4 and wide receiver 5 is what I'm getting at, and not even a lot for wide receiver 3. And then obviously you go over to tight end, you have Trey McBride and you have a bunch there, but it really is going to come down to those 3 guys probably. And then what Love gives you as a receiver in the pass game, which we had 59 targets, both of us right on the nose. I didn't know how really high to go on him in the passing game, considering that the Rams offense, we talked about a little bit earlier on the show, didn't do a ton of passing to the backs, but they're going to get Love the ball in space, I think. So anyway, it seems like it's going to be these 2 guys with McBride as the main dudes that get the volume. It's just really hard to figure out what you want to do with the different splits, with the Wilson thing being also, if you go first half, second half, and like, again, 18 total targets in the first 5 games. Wilson's yards per out run first 5 games was nothing. And then after that, it's incredible the rest of the way. Can you put that genie back in the bottle? Like, it is a new staff as well, though. Like, what do these things mean? My note on Wilson, his 2026 is likely to feature some combo of fewer routes. You mentioned he's got 1 away from Jamar Chase. Some combination of, where's my note? Fewer routes, more competition because Marvin Harrison's going to be on the field more, and potentially a weaker connection with the quarterback, because I do think the Brissett thing is very notable. The fact that he only had 18 targets in 5 college games, how does that play with Carson Beck if Carson Beck's playing half the year? Is it just a Brissett thing that really made Wilson as far as the ceiling goes? I don't really know about Wilson, man. It's like last year, I like to chase that type of ceiling, what he was doing on a weekly basis for a while there with Brissett. I have a hard time imagining drafting him based on just that, I guess, for a lot of the reasons that Jack just laid out as well. And then Marvin Harrison Jr. fits more what I want to think about on long view stuff, which is like, this guy's better as a prospect and has a better pedigree than what his last couple seasons have said. And so maybe the market's just overreacting, and we're getting a good price now to bet on a guy who's potentially a future star. I mean, there are guys who have started worse than him over the first 2 years and come around later. Devontae Adams is a great example of that we were just talking about. But the other key note, again, his yards per out run over the whole season is still similar to Michael Wilson's. It's just that Wilson ran a ton of routes. The whole thing is tricky.
I was expecting Marvin Harrison Jr.'s like per route stuff to be way worse when I looked into it. I was a little surprised. He's at a 21% target per out run in his career. He has 12 touchdowns on 189 targets. That's good 6.3% TD rate. So has been performing there. And then I do think you have the optimism of a new coaching staff being able to deploy him in that Devontae Adams role that Jack alluded to there, that'll officially unlock him. But no, I think that, the market is just so down on him, and it's obviously an expectations thing, right? When you get drafted 4th overall and you're the best wide receiver prospect ever to come out of Ohio State, and, who's just continued to churn out high level wide receivers in the NFL, the expectations were just out of control there, and he certainly fell short. But I think he's probably had a better career start to his career than most people would anticipate. And I do think your note on Wilson's connection with Brissett is an interesting one, because looking into Wilson's stuff too, he was 5th last year in contested targets, and then was 2nd in terms of his contested catches converted on the season. He had the second highest percentage of converting those contested targets behind only Puka Nacua, who was first in the NFL. So it's just another feather in Puka's cap there. But Wilson really excelled in that department. I think Brissett, ended up trusting him a ton. And when he was dropping back, he's like, man, I'm throwing it to Michael Wilson or Trey McBride, and one of those two are going to come down with it. So yeah. So I think it's a pretty fragile profile. But man, as you guys have alluded to the upside Wilson did display is tough to ignore overall.
It feels a lot like the Parker Washington, Brian Thomas thing too, where you're like, but Marvin Harrison has an even better prospect profile than Brian Thomas did. But it's like, man, what do you do with, I don't know. you get the 2025 hit, didn't have as much of a long-term profile in Michael Wilson, but there's some interesting stuff. He's always been an efficient player per target and stuff, which is sort of similar to the Parker Washington thing. And then I should want to play Marvin Harrison, but Michael Wilson was really good last year, so it's tricky.
All right, let's wrap up this receiving group and look towards the tight ends here. Obviously, Trey McBride headlines the trio. They also have Elijah Higgins at tight end 2 and Tip Ryman at tight end 3. They were relatively healthy 12 personnel team last year. I do wonder if LaFleur brings over some 13 personnel tendencies. They at least have the base personnel to do it here with Higgins and Ryman being somewhat capable, second and third tight ends here. We talked about McBride's just outrageous routes run last year, but what really set him off in fantasy was the touchdown spike. And that was the knock on McBride coming into last year was, man, this guy can't score touchdowns. He's never going to be able to score touchdowns. And sure enough, he ended up with 11 last season after scoring only 6 in his first 3 seasons. So last year was a 6.5% touchdown rate. He had a 2% touchdown rate in his first 3 seasons. This is stuff that is kind of tough to pin down exactly where to project for the upcoming season. So, at Trey McBride, we're at 4.5% touchdown rate. Gretch is at 4%. In terms of overall targets, we're pretty even here. We're at 130 targets, Gretch at 134. So honestly, the TD rate was something I was interested to see where Gretch landed. I don't know if you put a whole lot of thought into that, just kind of given the explosion from last season, but that's really, again, what separated McBride as like the very, very clear tight end 1 last year in points per game. So like, can that continue? It's to be determined, but right now we're projecting about 6 touchdowns receiving for McBride, and Gretch is more around 5.5.
Yeah, it was tricky. No, I put a lot of thought into it. I think on this series last year, I was projecting McBride to score a lot more touchdowns, and Leone was not happy with me because he was like, you can't just project a guy to do something that he's never done before. And, I think Leone was right because he only had 1 TD in 5 games with Kyler Murray. And then you get the surprise, no Kyler Murray, and then suddenly he's got 10 touchdowns in 12 games the rest of the way with a different quarterback than you're expecting to be in there. And we find out that maybe it had more to do with Kyler Murray than it did with Trey McBride. He tied for the top of the position with 11, like you said. It wasn't just that he improved a little bit. And it's funny, I went over that in my Field Tipper series where like I was like sort of proud of that I did a little more of the art than the science and did project this guy who's an elite talent to score more than he had shown, because I felt like it was, there, and that was a fair thing to do. And even still, I think I only projected him for like 5 or 6 touchdowns, and then he goes on and scores 11. And so like I didn't even have him close to being the tight end 1 in my projections last year. It just gets back to this thing of like, we're looking for outliers and these crazy things that are sometimes often unprojectable. It's not something that I foresaw at all that he would go out and score 11 times. But it's tricky to know what we're going to see this year. I mean, I did give it a lot of thought this year as well. And I was telling you guys actually a little bit, this was the last team I was doing before we jumped on, that my initial run of Arizona had them scoring too many offensive touchdowns, which often happens with the teams that are way on the tails. And I had to nuke McBride's touchdown rate a little bit. I wanted to regress him less, but I ended up regressing him more than I wanted to, just to get the team touchdowns a little lower. I also had to take touchdowns off of Jeremiah Love from where I would have liked to have his numbers. But yeah, as far as McBride's, the rest of his profile, other than the touchdowns, I still think there's a lot there to like. One of the things I talk about with the routes, I think the routes are going to come way down. What's interesting is when you run that many routes, you get a lot of empty routes, right? His yards per route run was 1.78 last year in his massive breakout season. He had been over 2 both of the first 2 years, so he was meaningfully lower. His targets per route run, fell 2.5 points. In 23 and 24, it was a matching 25.9%. It went all the way down to 23.5% in the season where he had 51 more targets than any other tight end. Like, that's what happens when you run that many routes, is you do have the empty routes and everything. And so it's actually, there's a little bit of per route meat on the bone. I don't want people to be too concerned with the route regression, because as the routes do come down, as the offense looks different, he's already shown an ability to get more targets per route and more yards per route. And so it should offset that some. It's going to be tough for him to match the number. I will say it's very fascinating to me on Trey McBride. He was an early third-round pick last year, about like 25th in ADP on Underdog. I checked this a little while ago. I haven't checked recently where he's at, but he was basically at the exact same spot this year, despite coming off one of the greatest tight end seasons of all time that confirmed like a huge upside and long-term positive on McBride. It does speak to the offensive environmental situation here, and the concern about, what the environment was last year. But this also, to me, feels a little bit like one of those things where I talked about like over regressing sometimes in one of the earlier teams that we talked about. I think the fantasy market's smart enough to know we need to pull the routes out. We need to do all that stuff. We need to, like, he's not going to run 700 routes again this year. At the same time, like, this dude had 160 targets last year. He had 50 more targets than any other tight end. Like, I don't think you want to be so over regressing it that you're like out on a player who was the focal point of their offense. And even though they have a new regime, I think is going to be the focal point of that offense because he's just a superstar.
He also doesn't really have super notable splits with Marvin Harrison Jr. on and off the field. That, like we talked about with Mike Wilson, the huge gap there. Trey McBride has been very consistently in the mid 20% in terms of target per out run, regardless of who is on the field alongside of him. So, I think the role is kind of a little bit impenetrable in that regard. But yeah, Jack, we did start the offseason with Trey McBride as the tight end one and have since kind of flipped Bowers ahead. We alluded to that on the AFC West pod as well, but just kind of curious your thoughts on the inputs here with McBride. Is that something I know you've been tinkering with a little bit as the offseason has progressed here?
Yeah, we lowered McBride recently, mostly just to get Bowers ahead in target share. I think given the competition that they both have, when one guy has Marvin Harrison, Michael Wilson, Jeremiah Love, and the other guy has Trey Tucker and Jalen Naylor to compete with for targets, I think even if McBride has been such a dominant target earning force over the past few years from a target share perspective, he's been 28 and 26% the last few years. I think given what Bowers did as a rookie, combined with the inferior target competition, it makes sense to have him ahead in terms of how much of the pie each of them are getting. And so now with that, and with both of them being on projected terrible offenses, we now have Bowers ahead. But like Gretch said, it's not a knock on McBride at all. I do think the touchdown rate stuff is interesting. The splits with Kyler and with Brissett, and the narrative that Kyler, given his height, kind of struggled to hit McBride in the red zone. That's kind of one I believe, just because of how stark the splits are. And so I think with Brissett and Beck, maybe we start to see not quite the level of touchdown scoring in such a bad offense as we saw with McBride last year. But I do think that the stuff we saw with Kyler earlier in his career is probably partially based on that narrative going around about the height.
One note I had on you mentioned on Bowers is that his 2025 represents some of the concerns for McBride's 2026. And I mentioned Bowers ran the most tight end routes in 2024. And so going into last year, if you're trying to find knocks on Bowers or trying to visualize like what his season could look like, I mean, the injury obviously was part of it for Bowers, but also just the different team environment. We talked about on the last show about how the Raiders just had a really poor offensive season. If this team is just really bad, if LaFleur is not it as the coach, if Carson Beck is not it, obviously we saw Brissett was able to at least sustain some things for them, but maybe Brissett gets hurt or something and he's not able to play. You could get into a team environment situation that's what the market is projecting for these guys. So that part of it is really concerning for me for McBride. As a huge fan of McBride's, I'm worried that I also just got done saying we don't want to over regress, but it's probably going to be a very different season this year for the Cardinals.
Yeah, I think the schedule is worth bringing up here. I think maybe if people aren't aware of the schedule, they're thinking this offense has these great skill pieces. How are they implied for so few points? They just have an absolutely unbelievable schedule. Like the worst I can ever remember. The first time that they are less than a touchdown underdog is in week 12, which will also potentially contribute to how long Brissett can remain the starter. It's just a terrible schedule, and that really drags down all of the offensive pieces from a scoring expectation standpoint.
It's also super funny from the perspective of like, they're always worried about when do we throw the rookie into the wolves or whatever? When do we start him? Like, he's going to be a touchdown underdog regardless.
It's wild. Yeah. I mean, the NFC West, one of the best conference or divisions in the NFL. So they play all those teams twice. You know, San Francisco, one of their games in week 18, so not in the fantasy season, but in terms of out of division schedule, they also play the Lions, the Broncos, the Chiefs, and the Eagles. So again, just, you know, all those opponents are stacked up. They have a late week 14 bye as well. So it's going to be an absolute gauntlet until they get to their bye week. You know, pretty much their softest opponent in the first 13 games is a game at the New York Giants in week 4, but that's going to be a 1 p.m. Eastern time start, you know, for a team traveling from Arizona. So even a really difficult setup there, just traveling on the road. It's going to be wild to see. Like I was the fact that we're, you know, kind of like so in lockstep on a team play calling level and even across the players, I think is just truly wild. And this is, I just like, am so eager to see this play out for the Cardinals, kind of given the setup coming off of the outlier year they had in 2025.
And I will add, if you somehow make it to the fantasy playoffs with some of these Cardinals players who face the NFL's worst schedule of all time through the first 14 weeks, they do get the Jets, Saints, and Raiders in the playoffs. So you do get a little bit of a payoff if you can make it to the playoffs. I think they have the biggest difference between, they're either first or second in their difference in their implied team total in weeks 1 through 14 versus weeks 15 through 17. It's not like they're suddenly implied for a bunch of points in the fantasy playoffs, but it is a pretty significant difference from the fantasy regular season.
That's dope.
Absolutely, yeah. So don't draft these guys. Just trade for them ahead of like week 10 or whenever the trade deadline is. I know Jack and I will be all over that on the rest of season top 150 show this year for sure. All right, that will do it for episode 4 of the divisional projection series. Appreciate all of you tuning in with us. Thanks again to Jack and Gretch for doing this with me and providing all of the great insight you guys have had over the last 2.5 hours here. Be sure to give them a follow on Twitter at JackMiller02 and Gretch at YardsPerGretch. Really appreciate all the support here for this series. We are officially halfway through, fellas. That is pretty awesome. Again, a little bit of a gap here as we handle some, you know, family vacations and other summer dealings to happen over the next couple of weeks. So we'll be back on the airwaves here in a couple of weeks. Have a good day, everyone. Peace out.